Buyers and the ones.
351.
You're right.
These ones here. Who is?
No problems. Literally the one.
What did you think of your sleeve,
There
really?
you are. You've been moved.
What do you think? That's something. Well,
Be tight.
Yeah.
Wonder if they are. No. No way. Keep on my life.
Welcome to the hot seat.
Very good, David. Did you say you had questions? Can I formally welcome everybody here to the phase 3 of the inquiry, and this afternoon we have a number of witnesses called this afternoon. We have Will Herr, Elder Cousin, Jim Wilkinson and Michael Sands. I can formally welcome all of you here this afternoon. I think you've been made aware, obviously, in advance of what we're specifically dealing with here today, and I appreciate these are very wide-ranging and sometimes complex matters, but we obviously have a specific term of reference which we're addressing. You've been advised of that, and we've been asked to deal with specific elements of the concerns the committee has raised in terms of this inquiry. So I think, well, I understand you have an opening
yeah, sorry, just
to provide the members, and just to say to members that you'll find in your electronic packs, page 351, a list of items are for your attention. I'll just remind the members just to be mindful of the protocols around use of electronic device. So without any further ado, if you're happy enough,
Yeah.
take an opening statement, or anyone else for that matter, Heather, Jim or Megan.
thank you, Chairman. I just like to make some opening remarks in relation to this phase 3 of your inquiry, just to kind of hopefully assist you in setting the scene and some of the key events in relation to this particular phase. I mean, while the terms of reference of this phase obviously relates to the whole decision-making relating to the award, modification and cancellation of NIHE maintenance contracts, the key events and decisions you've been focusing on your questions to us and the written request you made focus mainly on events and decisions in relation to the termination of the Red Sky contracts in July 2011. The memorandum which we've given you actually sets out sort of the full background, I think, to the whole maintenance issue as well, and then obviously the details on that, and I hope that is useful to the committee in what is obviously a complex phase. I just want to give a quick set of reference sort of some of the key events, but may I say, clearly I'm not going to be comprehensive in that. So on the 13th of April of that year, the Housing Executive Board considered a proposal to terminate the response maintenance contracts held by the Red Sky Group Limited. The board papers sought the board's agreement on the basis the Housing Executive considered that it had lost all trust and confidence in the Red Sky Group to issue a 3-month termination notice in respect of all the response maintenance contracts held by them, and this was approved by the board, and 3-month notice termination became effective from the 14th of April of that year, and it obviously was widely reported at that time. On taking up post on May 2011, Minister McCausland expressed his concerns about the issues relating to the Housing Executive's management of contracts on fruiting briefing that officials gave in relation to the review of governance in the Housing Executive in 2010 and on the issues leading to the termination of the Red Sky contracts. In particular, the contract that he was concerned that contract management failings might exist across contracts and not just in one particular contract, namely that of Red Sky. Then, on the 17th of May, Robin Newton MLA wrote the Minister requesting an urgent meeting, along with Sammy Douglas MLA and representatives of Red Sky, to make the Minister aware of their concerns regarding the termination of the housing executives' contracts and the implications for the company and their employees. On the 27th of May, departmental officials advised Minister McCausland that he should decline this invitation, as this was an ongoing contractual matter between the housing executive and Red Sky. However, the Minister made the decision not to decline the meeting, and this was subsequently held on the 27th of June 2011. Subsequent to this, the Minister had a number of meetings on the 28th of June with officials and with the Chairman and the Acting Chief Executive of the Housing Executive to discuss concerns about contract management and the termination of the Red Sky contracts. And I just say that from a departmental official point of view, there were 4 key issues to be addressed throughout this time. First, ensuring the provision of appropriate response maintenance service to tenants, to make sure that service was there. Secondly, the TUPE arrangements in relation to the employees of Red Skies were progressing, clearly essential in employment terms. Thirdly, addressing the Minister's concerns that the issues which led to the termination of Red Sky contracts could be present in other contracts which might not have been the subject to any full investigation. And finally, that the issues relating to the termination of the contracts with Red Sky by the housing executive were contractual matters between the housing executive and the administrators. And as you'll see from the written documentations we've given you, and I think there's vast tomes of those which we've been able to provide for you, we have been consistent and clear on advice in relation to these matters. I say of equal importance to us was that the new contracts which addressed concerns about the overall response payment contract, that the new contracts should be in place as soon as possible. And that's a rather key issue behind all this and some of the dating of this issue, because we were trying to get new contracts in place which would be much better robust and would be in response maintenance, would address the needs of tenants and the customer. So those are kind of the themes which will come out again and again in our briefing. At a meeting then on the 30th of June 2011 with the Chairman and the Acting Chief Executive of the Housing Executive, the Minister advised that he wanted to ensure that he had public and personal confidence in relation to the Housing Executive contracts. He also advised that he had received information from the Housing Executive that indicated there were some emerging issues with another company. He therefore had asked his department, those of us here, for a forensic examination to take place on the management of contracts, and in his view it was inappropriate to issue or assign contracts until this examination was complete. I believe at that time it was thought that examination could take place in the region of about 8 weeks. The Minister asked the Housing Executive to take this proposal to the Board and to recommend his proposal, provided that the Administrator could guarantee to conduct the work. The Housing Executive representatives, that was the Chairman and the Acting Chief Executive, expressed concerns about this, and I, having arrived late in the meeting, advised that the Housing Executive would need to work through the issues highlighted, that officials would need to work through these issues and report back to the Minister. I also noted both the officials in the Department and the Northern Ireland Housing Executive would face challenges but need to look at the Minister's request in taking forward the investigation, and we need to look at all the implications. You will also be aware from the documents released by the Department to the Committee that on the 1st of July 2011, I also wrote to the Minister about the issue of a direction under Article 10(1) of the Housing Northern Ireland Order, and gave him advice on that issue in the situation that the Housing Executive did not fulfil his request. Minister McCausland had indicated that his reason for seeking an extension of the termination of the Red Sky contracts and a proposal to assign these to neighbouring contracts was to allow officials to carry out a forensic investigation of a sample of contractors, including those who who would be taking forward the Red Sky contracts to give him assurance that the problems identified in Red Sky were not endemic across the Northern Housing Executive contractors. However, in that advice, I set out a number of factors to be taken into account in relation to the issue of a direction, and I recommended that a direction should not be issued to the Housing Executive in relation to this matter, as I did not believe that the reasons and any supporting evidence was sufficiently rigorous in this matter to justify the issue of a direction. Indeed, I indicated that should the Minister believe a direction was required, then I, as an accounting officer, would need a ministerial direction to direct me. In the event, the committee will be aware that the Minister did not issue a direction. On the 1st of July 2011, he wrote formally to the Housing Executive Chairman in relation to his request. He confirmed that he had asked officials to carry out a forensic investigation, and he formally asked the Chairman to put it to the Housing Executive Board that the termination date of the Red Sky contracts should be extended from 14th July 2011, subject to the Administrator stating that he could continue to allow an open procurement competition for the Red Sky contracts to be undertaken with immediate effect. This extension to the contract with the Administrator would be for a period of 6 months or until new contract procedures could be in place. I was point out to you that there was this whole question of trying to renew this whole set of contracts. This procurement exercise would have meant that Red Sky contracts would be subject to open procurement rather than to reassignment, but was subject, say, to the Administrator confirming the Administrator could continue to service the contracts until that time. Nobody else could do that. I also arranged to meet with the Housing Executive Chairman on the Monday, the 4th of July, to discuss the Minister's letter of the 1st of July and to ensure that the nature of the Minister's request set out in his letter was fully understood both by the Housing Executive and the Department. The committee will be clear from the evidence they've received and from their own knowledge of the events that this was a really complex issue, which attracted a high level of media attention and significant debate at that time, and had been subject to a lot of discussion between housing executive officials and departments. It was therefore really important to me that the Chair of the Housing Executive was clear exactly what was being asked. It was not a direction he was being given, it was a request for him to look at this issue, to put it to the board, and emphasising the point about the role of the Administrator. You will, of course, be aware that the Housing Executive Board then met on the 5th of July to discuss the situation and the Minister's letter to the Chairman of the 1st of July. Following this, the Chairman wrote to the Minister that day and advised the Board had asked him to express their deep concern at the stance of being taken in relation to the termination of the Red Sky contracts. The contracts, he stated, had been terminated through thorough and extensive forensic investigations, and the Board formed the view that the trust and confidence necessary for the satisfactory operation of contracts had been profoundly undermined, and Red Sky had been advised of this on the 13th of April 2011. The Board that morning, that's the morning of the 5th of July, reconfirmed that view in respect to the Red Sky in administration. The Chairman's letter then went on to advise the Board had resolved that if a direction was issued, they would immediately challenge the legality of such a direction in the High Court. They had instructed legal representatives to take the necessary preparatory action, and they had put the High Court on notice that it may be necessary to convene an urgent judicial review hearing at short notice. You will note that the Minister's letter of the 1st of July to the Chairman did not refer to the issue of a direction. Also, the Chairman's reply of the 5th of July did not, in fact, answer the Minister's specific request in relation to the ability of the Administrator to service the contracts while an open procurement exercise is undertaken. Further clarity on that aspect was received by email from the Housing Executive's Head of Procurement on the 6th of July 2011, the next day. Then on that day, having got that, I briefed the Minister in relation to the Board's response to his request, and based on the information provided, I recommended that the Minister should advise the Housing Executive to move forward with their proposal to reassign contracts to adjacent contractors to ensure continued provision of services to tenants. I also recommended that in relation to the affected Red Sky employees, the Minister should seek assurances from the Chairman that the neighbouring contractors had the appropriate duty arrangements in place, and that the Housing Executive would put in place robust and appropriate contract monitoring arrangements. The Minister did write then to the Chairman on the 7th of July on this basis and confirmed that the Housing Executive should proceed to the termination of the Red Sky contracts from the 14th of July and move forward with a proposal to reassign contracts to adjacent contractors to ensure the continued provision of services to tenants. And you will remember the Chairman that the Minister, I think, met with you on the 6th of July to brief you on these issues. So the termination did take place on the 14th of July. I hope that gives you a quick overview of the key sort of issues around that time, and say it's all set out in more detail in the memorandum. So we're very happy to take questions.
Okay, well, thank you for that, for bringing in members. Just to make a couple of points. First of all, that table's very noisy.
I haven't got any options. Mickey's got his options. And sure. Different table.
Okay, so people just be conscious of that, because it is affecting the microphones and other people's ability to hear what's going on. We're bringing the members, obviously. Well, thanks for that, Derek. But just to remind ourselves that we're dealing with phase 3 of the inquiry. We have a particular term of reference. We're not reinvestigating contracts or any of that business. That's no part of our remit whatsoever. We just take what's been there, what's happened with contracts terminated or reissued or whatever else. That's all been done, as a matter of fact. We are, as I say, investigating whether or not there was any political or inappropriate dealings with regard to all this matter, so not need to rehearse that, but just to remind ourselves the kind of parameters within which we're dealing with. Could I actually ask, will you, I mean, in the memorandum that you've presented to us, you refer to a meeting with a number of MLAs requested with the Minister, and the officials clearly suggested, advised the Minister to decline that. But in paragraph 13, it also then advises that the Tax Advisor actually had amended the draft response, which in effect then basically advised that the meeting would go ahead. As accounting officer and permanent secretary, do you feel that advice should have been adhered to? I mean, and you obviously have set out all of the kind of legal procedural implications for doing otherwise, given the fact that the contract in question was subject to legal contractual issues between the housing sector and the contractor. So, I mean, what I'm basically putting to you, because it's very clearly pertinent to this particular phase, you and others officials gave clear advice to the Minister to decline that meeting. But that advice was not adhered to, and in fact, the Special Advisor, according to your memorandum, actually redrafted the meeting that basically said to the MLA, if you feel the meeting still beneficial, please contact, so on. I mean, that's a stark contradiction of the advice given, I would suggest, I mean, as it's written upon of us, and that's the type of thing that obviously we have to look into.
A point, I might ask Jim to come in because he was actually involved maybe on this, but on this, I mean, I suppose the point is one puts advice to ministers, but ministers, it's the job of ministers to decide, and you know, ministers have the right to decide. And as a civil servant all my career, I've had to put advice to ministers, and ministers sometimes have taken it, but they've sometimes taken a different view. That is, you know, the key issue for myself is that you give the best professional advice you can give. You set out the issues, and I think, for example, we put legal advice in relation to issues of the issue, and actually very clear advice came in the briefing to when the meeting was set up, which said, you know, here are the limits of what the minister can involve in this area, because the key point, the contractual issues are the responsibility of the housing executive, and the minister has got roles in relation to the housing executive, but not in relation to the contracts, and in that in sort of informal process. So that was something which I say is fairly normal. The ministers will take their, it's always the ministers must make their decisions. But if there was an issue, and I think you'll see in the documentation, very rightly, somebody said I think there was an issue about changing the advice, or not changing the advice, but, and we always make about special advisors the issues. The special advisor has got total right, his duty, it's part of his or her job to give his or her views to the minister, but it's the minister who must always decide, and we always make sure it is the minister who is making the decision.
I mean, I do appreciate that, Will, and obviously you can't answer for somebody else, and they'll have to answer presumably at some point themselves. But the point I'm making here is that, against very specific advice from yourself and other senior officials, and against the knowledge that the housing executive were about to go to court on this issue, and had already alerted judges and lawyers and all the rest of that you then not only, but you're telling the committee in your memorandum and your evidence is that it wasn't just the minister that came back, it was actually a special advisor in this instance came back. So would you not have felt that you need to go back and say, excuse me, let me remind you of the advice I've given to the minister? Because that seems, very difficult for us to understand how a person in your own position, the status that you would have, and the statutory role that you would have, that you would be overruled effectively by bad.
So, I mean, there's, and as accounting officer, there are certain roles, because I'm responsible to you in the Assembly about money, and that's my authority as accounting officer comes at. In role of principal advisor, I have a role, hopefully, to make sure advice isn't, but it is always the role of the right minister and the minister to make the decision. That is how it's set out. But you're talking about legal challenge at the time. There was not the legal challenge we discussed was later, obviously, when the Housing Executive Board felt near that time. There wasn't a question of legal challenge at that process when the request for the meeting took place. In fact, we are very clear that legally the minister has an absolute right to attend such meetings in the process. They just need to have very clear advice of what they can say, what their role is. You see that, and you've seen the briefing that was given to them, and you see their line to take there, which sets out very clearly what the minister could say. And my understanding is that that was the minister who made those points, and that was remade by Jim New at the meeting.
I think just for clarification, the briefing from officials in relation to the request for a meeting was very clear, and the committee has seen the advice that went. The minister had that briefing. In addition, he had special advisors' comments.
Would you just reiterate, Jim, just the record, because obviously we have it, but the record wouldn't show it.
So the
But
briefing,
the advice actually was being very clear.
the advice from officials in relation to the request for a meeting was to decline the meeting, as this was a contractual matter between the Housing Executive and may be subject to ongoing legal proceedings. And that advice was with the minister. The special advisor added his advice. The minister considered both, and then the letter was issued, as you say, offering the meeting if it was felt to be appropriate. So as well as described, the role of officials is to provide advice. The minister takes a decision, and the role of officials is to support the minister in that decision, and that culminated in the second briefing, which was clear advice to the minister in terms of how the meeting should proceed. So it's that sort of process that happens, and that's quite common.
Yeah.
Okay. Maggie Brady, then Jim.
Yeah, thanks very much for the presentation. In terms of the Sky contract and the publication by the chair of the Housing Executive that it was to be terminated, did the department take any steps to satisfy themselves that that was the correct course of action? Now, obviously, you were getting notification, but did you, as the permanent secretary of the department, for your officials, did you take any cognizance of the fact that there may be something to investigate? From your point of view, Ryan, just accepted what the Housing Executive was saying?
It is the job of the Housing Executive to run those contracts, and it's their job to make sure that they do everything in due process. I knew from the past, because the issue of the Red Sky has been some debate about and how you handle these contracts. I knew that there was concerns about what there had been debate within the Housing Executive. I remember saying to the chairman, when because he rang me up just before and said, well, you'll have got legal advice that you're absolutely clear on that point. You're clear that this was, he confirmed to me that he had, and I said, well, fine, thank you for notifying me, and it is not the role of the department to investigate to micromanage the board. That's the responsibility of the board to handle their contract.
But would there be no discussion with the Housing Executive as to their reasons why they wanted to terminate the contract?
There was, they clear to us, I say we did not go into detail on that issue. I knew that they'd been considering that issue. They made very clear that in that part of the contract about their confidence in the contract, that there was clauses that the evidence that they felt that they had the right to terminate that contract. That had been put to the board, and the board agreed that. So it was not the role of the department to investigate that.
Could I also ask you, on the 20th of April 2011, there was a meeting between senior Housing Executive officials, including the Chair and Chief Executive, and members of the DUP. For DSD management, were you briefed on that at all?
No,
Either in
sorry.
advance of the meeting or after the meeting?
No, sorry, no, we weren't. I think after the meeting we'd have heard about it, but I don't think we certainly weren't briefed before. That was being dealt with by the chair.
Would you normally expect to get a briefing on a meeting of that magnitude?
Or was it not the case that, Jim, you not at that meeting?
No, that's different.
That's a different meeting.
I think this is a meeting on the 28th of April held in the Housing Executive. No, the department didn't receive briefing in advance of that. I think after the meeting, I think it was advised that a meeting had taken place sometime thereafter at the next performance meeting.
Yes.
But following a meeting like that or prior to a meeting like that, would it be normal not to get a briefing, or would it be normal to get a briefing?
Well, it's a very major organisation and meets with many MLAs on many issues. So obviously it was a significant issue. They obviously felt it was an important meeting. It would come over in the political sphere, the whole issue of Red Sky. So I think they will have reported in that context. But there's no rule which says that they have to report every meeting, and suddenly that would be strange.
I think the point is this was a particular meeting about a particular issue.
And I say that I think we did get some feedback that such a meeting had taken place after the event, but not beforehand.
Not before, not copies and minutes.
Are you at liberty to disclose the nature of the feedback that you got?
It's hard to recall. I just recall there was a performance review meeting where it said a meeting had taken place.
Yeah.
It's an important issue, but
Yeah.
nothing more significant.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jim, Alistair.
Yeah, the meeting on the 27th of June, the one between the DUP, the Minister and representatives of Red Sky, if that's who you were representing. You, the officials, had given clear advice against the holding of that meeting because you took the view that matters to be discussed were contractual issues for the Housing Executive. It was also a meeting to involve representatives of a company, if they were representing the company, which was in administration. Had you any concerns about that dimension?
Jim, I don't advise that. I don't.
I suppose, the issue really was having provided the advice on the meeting, when the meeting was taking place. Our role was to provide the most appropriate advice and recommendations to the Minister, and on that we sought legal advice, so we were content that the briefing we provided for the Minister in advance of the meeting, both in relation to who he was meeting, more importantly the role of the department and the role of the Minister, that was fairly clear. So we were content that the briefing for the meeting made quite clear the position in relation to any matters that might fall into the contractual
And
sphere.
in what capacity were the two gentlemen, Mr. Rooney and Mr. Cook, what capacity were they attending the meeting?
Well, my understanding of their capacity was from the original invitation letter, which referred to representatives from Red Sky and MLAs.
And Red Sky by then being Red Sky in administration,
Well, yes, the company was in administration.
but no representative from the administrator.
No, nor the Housing Executive.
Yes, that's the second point. Was it not a little odd that there was going to be a meeting to discuss the termination of a contract by the Housing Executive with Red Sky? Red Sky are there, though, in administration, but the Housing Executive aren't. Had you any reservations about that?
I think the important element and through the briefing was that we were quite clear the matters relating to the termination of the contract and any contractual matters were between the Housing Executive and the Administrator. So therefore, first of all, the briefing request and update was passed to the Housing Executive, so we were quite clear who was meeting and the Housing Executive were asked to provide input to it. But if the Department's advice is that there should be any contractual matters have to be discussed, then not having the parties who were discussing the contractual matters meant that they couldn't be discussed at that meeting.
But was there discussion at that meeting about the formation of a new company?
I think, yes, well, I need to refer to the minutes, but I think the minutes cover a wide variety of issues.
And who was going to form this new company?
I think my understanding, again, if I could refer to the minutes, were that a number of the
I don't know if your pages are the same as mine.
I don't think they are.
495, if it's any
Other
help.
than debate, but yes,
We
my
can refer members,
understanding,
sorry, Jim, we can refer members to
495.
496, 495, 6,
Four nine-
the electronic pack, 495 and 6.
just so entirely accurate, let me call up. Give them minutes.
Just a moment.
Yes,
Peter Cook gave the minister a brief history to the company and advised on how they were trying to establish a new company
Yes.
to acquire the entire Red Sky business, including Bel Air, from the administrator. Now, what did you understand from that meeting of what was being said, or what they would have liked to have done with that new company?
my understanding as much as the minutes record, that these individuals were aspiring to set up a new company and to acquire the Red Sky business.
And take over the Red Sky contracts with the housing executive,
Well, to acquire the Red Sky business,
which at that point included contracts.
well, may or may not, and included, contracts were to terminate on the
Yes.
14th of July.
If they didn't terminate, which of course was the further thrust of what the minister was advocating hereafter, they would be there to be acquired.
Well, that would be a slight, so the acquirement of the contracts would be a matter for the housing side and
Yes.
their procurement.
But Red Sky's representatives were making it clear they wanted to form a new company to supersede Red Sky and take over the various Red Sky contracts.
Yes, that's,
Yes.
was
Did they put a name to that company?
no,
Do you recall the name Totalis?
no,
You never heard that?
no.
See.
Okay, moving on to further questions, Jim.
Yeah.
Back.
So at that meeting, there was this discussion of that nature. Did the minister express any view of it?
McKeon. I mean, as I said, we were quite clear in the briefing to the Minister for the meeting that any matters relating to contracts and the award of contracts would be a matter between the Administrator and the Housing Executive. In terms of the meeting, very much it was the Minister listening to reps.
Did the minister follow the advice he was given in the briefing?
That was content that, I think the Minister made it clear, as you'll see from the minutes of the meeting in paragraph 3, that the matters were currently with the Administrator.
Well, the minister had been advised that issues regarding the termination of the contract are contractual matters between two parties concerned. A minister has been appointed to oversee the affairs of companies and their activities and role is governed by the laws of insolvency. These matters are subject to ongoing legal processes in which the department has no role. That was the advice to the minister.
Yes.
Now, at this meeting, the minute records that the minister suggested that he wanted the administrator in place until the end of August. Now, was that compatible with the advice? Was he following the advice he'd been given?
Well, I think the key for me was the Minister expressed his view at that time.
Was that compatible with the line he'd been advised to take?
Well, yes, because the line, I'm quite content, and especially, and I followed up, while that was the Minister's view and what he would like to achieve, we were quite clear that the decision-making in relation to that would be entirely a matter between the Housing Executive and the Administrator.
Yes, but in making that proposition, how far was he crossing the line, if at all, in trying to shape and rewrite what the executive had already decided on a contractual matter?
Again, as I indicated, the meeting was a meeting listening to issues, hearing about the intentions of a company. I'm quite content. It was quite clear, and certainly at the end of the meeting, it was quite clear that, irrespective of these discussions, decision-making was entirely a
Yes, I
matter of the
understand that.
Executive.
But, Mr. Wilkinson, the advice given to the minister was, yes, if you're having this meeting, but here are guidelines, and the guidelines are, we do not interfere in the contractual arrangements or the termination of contracts by the Housing Executive. When the minister comes along to this meeting and seems to make a proposition which would involve such interference, namely that the contracts would not expire on the 14th of July, they would continue thereafter.
Again, I mean, the Minister made his position clear, and I think it was one of the consistent points that the Secretary Willis referred to, which he expresses the fact that he has concerns that existing contracts should be subject to the same level of scrutiny. He puts in point at the meeting, he refers to his view that this would allow some activity to the end of August. Again, our position has been quite clear in terms of, I mean, the Minister has a responsibility and has an interest in issues if they're brought to his attention, but the method for handling it is through the Housing Executive.
And in fact, what he next did was he wrote a letter asking for 6 months extension, not even to the end of August, for 6 months. And he wrote that unknown to the department. Is that what we were to understand?
No.
Just clarify that first.
So there was a number of meetings and discussion with the Minister, and we had to advise the Minister was, I think, particularly concerned at that time and decided that by that time, 6 months, his concern was, could he be sure that assigning them to other, there would be the same practices as Van Rensky in the contractors to whom the work was being assigned? Was it not, his argument was, get the new contracts in place, and then let an open competition take place. And my understanding, actually, Red Sky administration would not been able to compete in that area. It wouldn't have had the track record in prison. But there would be new contracts, so that we could be sure, he could be sure, that the tenants were getting a service from contractors who were all effective and good using the new contracts. And that was the 6 months. Came from that issue. Is that right?
I think really, I mean, just the contracts would have been following, obviously, this meeting. The Minister followed through on his concerns. As I've got concerns about the issues relevant in Red Sky might be prevalent elsewhere. There was a series of meetings to how this might be addressed. The Minister indicated his idea that this might be addressed by a forensic investigation.
Yes.
And also extending the contracts to allow new procurement to take place.
Yes. But the purpose in making that suggestion is revealed, is it not, in the minutes of the 27th of June, where it says the Minister advised he had asked officials to instruct NIHE to rigorously review all existing contracts to the same level of scrutiny. He also advised he would like to have the Administrator in place until the end of August to allow all issues relating to the handover of contracts to be considered. During this time, the proposed new company might also be able to progress matters. What did that mean?
That was the Minister's comment.
Well, could I suggest to you it's pretty clear what it means? It would give Red Sky time to reform themselves.
Well, I mean, that could be the case, but I think
Well,
the issue...
if that's what it meant, was that not a minister involving himself in promoting the commercial interests of a company?
I mean, I go back to the key
Was
point.
it not?
I think the key point that we made at the meeting, the key point in the briefing, was that any decision relating to the award of contracts, the extension of contracts, or the termination of contracts is a matter for the Housing Executive as a contracting authority and its contractors, or in this case, the Administrator. And that point's been very clear in all our briefing that
I'm not faulting your briefing.
the decision-making point was always with the Housing Executive.
I'm not faulting your briefing whatsoever. I'm asking you to apply the advice in the briefing to what actually happened at the meeting and answer the question whether or not it would appear that the Minister went beyond that advice and in fact ended up setting a scene to assist the commercial interests of a company at that meeting.
So, well, I said I'm content that the meeting began and ended with clarity as to who and where responsible.
And are you content that that minute that I read to you is accurate of what the Minister said?
As I said, with the minute of the meeting is the best recollection that I can come across.
So you don't quibble with that
27.
whatsoever?
No.
That the Minister said that this would give the proposed new company might also be able to give them time to progress the matters?
Absolutely. I couldn't recall every word of the discussion. I look at the minutes of the meeting and there's nothing I would dispute in that.
Yeah. Coming down to the meeting of the 30th of June that you were at, Mr. Heron.
Yes. Yeah.
The Minister said it would be inappropriate to terminate the contract till the forensic examination has been completed. That's the point he made to the Housing Executive.
Yeah.
Did you give them that advice or did you concur with that advice?
you see from the minutes, actually, I arrived after all this discussion.
Well, okay.
So, I mean, the answer is,
Well,
I mean...
does the department concur with that? That it would be inappropriate to terminate the contract on the scheduled date of 14th of July till the forensic examination had been complete. That was the Minister's contention. Was that on advice from your officials, or was that him on his own?
I think you have a copy of the advice, which, sorry, should be in your papers, I think, which I think Heather gave the advice on the 30th of June, and that will be the advice.
Well, it doesn't embrace, I would suggest to you, the Minister suggesting that we could push back this termination by 6 weeks. Because that would be interfering in a contractual matter, wouldn't it?
All I'm saying is all I can give you is the record.
Yes, well, let's not quibble, Mr.
Yeah, exactly.
You advised him to not interfere in a contractual matter. Advise the Minister contending with the Housing Executive that the termination should be pushed back 6 weeks. That is interfering in a contractual matter, isn't it?
The Minister has, the argument I think would be the Minister has advised making sure that the quality of service is right to the tenant. Therefore, he has a right to put the question to the Housing Board to consider whether they could put it back there and still fulfil their contractual process. And he does that on the 1st of July. It seems to me that he has a right to ask them, but he has not a right to direct them.
Well, you advised against the letter of the 1st of July, did you not, in the terms it went? Or did you?
No. I mean, that was the 1st of July. We accepted that was the advice comes up from Parliament saying you can go so far. You can ask, you can put it to the board.
Well, you
cannot
very
direct-
strongly advised him that he couldn't or shouldn't issue an Article 10 direction.
Absolutely, but the letter is not an Article 10 direction.
No, but it was moving in that direction.
It's putting that issue to the board, and of course the board does actually do some look at some of those issues, and does. And the key issue in this point, and it's key to the 1st of July letter, is the fact that any idea of pushing it back only works out if Red Sky and administration can continue to hold that contract. If it cannot do that, it cannot secure support. Any question of selling that business to anyone else, that brings it totally to the end. And I think Declan Allen, who will be, actually makes it absolutely clear, and we support absolutely that process.
In your experience, have you ever before encountered such an anticipated ministerial intervention in a contractual matter?
Sorry, have I had other ministers ask questions about these?
No. Have you ever before encountered a situation where such a ministerial intervention wanted to be made in a contractual matter?
That maybe is more to do with my experience than necessarily it ever happened before in the process. But personally, that this is the first time this came up in my experience in the housing sector in DSD. But that doesn't in itself may not be significant.
But in your experience, you'd never encountered such a proposed ministerial intervention before?
I personally had not come across this in my previous career. But that's all I can say.
Okay, well, you've answered that.
Thank you, Eva.
Okay, I mean...
A couple
can
of
I
questions
just-
later.
Yeah, that's not a problem, we want to bring other members in, but, I mean, sticking on this point, it's clear from the evidence and from the evidence we've heard today, as well as the written submissions, that advice was given, but not accepted by the Minister, to decline the meeting. Well, the meeting went ahead. It has really been brought to our attention that the administrators, for example, were not at that meeting. How appropriate do you feel that it was for yourselves to be at that meeting? Since, first of all, you had advised against it. You given very clear reasons why it shouldn't go ahead, that it could be potentially an interference with contractual matters. The minute of the meeting, in my view, shows it does actually. Certainly strays very close to that, because you have in the minute here, the Minister advised certain things were clearly at variance with what your advice was. So here you have the Minister at variance with the advice you've given. I want to ask you a specific question on this. Do you believe that the action as written and recorded in that minute, is that at variance with the advice that you give? And then on that basis, do you feel it was appropriate for senior members of the department to be actually at that meeting?
The minute records what the Minister said and thought at that meeting and process, and obviously that was, the Minister can answer for what he put down.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The key issue for that meeting, that was not a meeting which was about contractual arrangements, as such. In a sense, it was not one where there was any negotiation about contracts. Neither the Housing Executive, the contracting authority, or the Housing Administrator. This was a representation about issues, a concern about the handling of a termination and contract issue. I've argued that the MLAs have often bring up these issues of concern to Minister. This was brought to the Minister's attention, and the Minister felt it was his duty to listen to an MLA's attention. There was no decision at that meeting. It was the Minister listening and hearing a concern, but there was no action at that meeting, which was about the issue, of course, which you're exploring, is what the Minister subsequently did. That's it. But the actual meeting, that was, that was the one the Minister made his decision. But the question is, I mean, I've been in situations where I felt that contracts were being discussed, or things were being discussed versus, or so I can imagine myself being in a situation where I'd say, this is not appropriate, we stop.
But would you not accept, well, that if you were at a meeting, I think most people would presume if they're at a meeting with a Minister, and the Minister advises something to be done, a lot of weight would be put on what that Minister would say, because you would like to think the Minister, has influence on issues. That's why people want to go and speak to Ministers, which is an entirely appropriate thing to do very often. Probably people would like to meet Ministers more often to get their point of view across. And I'm not taking any issue with that. But I am taking issue, I'm trying to establish how far of a variance was there from the advice given not to be interfering in contract matters, and then someone actually telling people at a meeting, I'm advising that I want this particular course of action, in other words, the contract to continue on. Would that not, because that would suggest to me at the very least you'd be leading somebody up the garden path.
Well, I think the key issue, as Jim has referred to at the end of the meeting, the Minister makes quite clear, it's the issue for the Housing Executive issue, and that makes absolutely clear in that process. So he has left everybody in that meeting absolutely clear that that is where the decision making is based.
Did you make it clear to people at the meeting? Is that what
Yes, but I think.
So the Minister had to say, then you come in and
No, the Minister.
by the way,
The Minister. The Minister had. I think, just to put sort of in context. I think I'm quite clear the role of officials were to support ministers when implement their decisions. Our role was to support the Minister at that meeting.
Sorry.
Sorry, Jim. But how was it communicated at the start and the end of the meeting? Because obviously, if the Minister makes a comment like that, the Minister may well be right. But you're actually telling us that, notwithstanding what the Minister said, according to the record, that the meeting was left in no doubt that the decision will be taken by the Housing Executive.
Yes.
So how was that communicated? Did you, as a senior officer, did you actually say, well, the Minister has just said that, but by the way, here's the reality?
The minutes record. The Minister records. The minutes record. I'll quote. Because there was a number of issues discussed at the meeting. One of them being new information contrary to the briefing we had from the Housing Executive regarding termination dates. And the minutes conclude, Jim Wilkinson advised that further clarification needs to be sought from the Housing Executive, and the Minister advised this will be available tomorrow. He further indicated that the route for consideration of contractual matters between the Housing Executive and the Administrator was quite clear.
Okay.
That the Minister was giving his view and his opinion, but it's very, very clear that the route for pursuing that view is through the Housing Executive, and the subsequent submissions and letters are all about recognising the role of the Housing Executive in taking those decisions.
Okay, thank you, Jim, for that. Michael?
Thanks, Chair. Just a wee bit of, I'm not a lawyer, I just want to get a bit of background to this. In awarding contracts that are subject to tender, the contracts that we're discussing that were previously by Red Sky, presumably will come again in the future, is past performance taken into account?
I think in fact some questions have been asked about the issue. You're going to have an expert coming to you. The next Declan Allen will be able to give you. I think it's been a contentious issue in the past, but I think at that time I'm not sure it was possible. But now I think that there is process, and in fact this new EU directive is going to make it even more possible. But it's quite a contentious and complex issue, and you'll see there was correspondence. I think I've responded to some issue to give advice for. We tried to tighten within law how that's done, but it's difficult.
Is it taken into account or not?
Depends on the nature of the contract that was awarded.
Yeah.
Would it have been taken into account in the awarding of the contracts following on from these?
My understanding, again, you'll have a chance to talk to the experts in the area after this. My understanding was that
It wouldn't.
It wouldn't have for the previous contracts, but it will for many future contracts.
Yes, no,
And there's some discussions.
I understand that, but it's just, if we have, and again, I want to get my mind around the legal entity. The meeting was attended by people previously connected with Red Sky. Red Sky was a separate legal entity as it was in administration. So were the people there as people formerly connected with Red Sky, or people possibly connected with a new company that might rise from the ashes?
Well, as I mentioned before, in terms of how they were identified for officials, it was in the nature of the letter that requested the meeting, which said, request a meeting with MLAs and representatives from Red Sky, and that's how they're noted on the attendance at the meeting. It's quite clear from the minutes of the meeting, there are also people who are talking about forming a new company.
But did Red Sky exist as a legal entity at that stage? Has that
There
not
would
been
have been Red
developed
Sky
by
Administration.
administration? That's a different legal entity as far as I'm aware. So, did no one pick up on that? That there is something that didn't exist?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think insofar as we were, insofar as the advice is very clear that the legal decisions on operation of the Red Sky and administration contract rested with Red Sky administration. That's very clear throughout the briefing.
Okay.
This wasn't Red Sky administration. They were not able to take decisions in relation to the activities under the contract.
And that perhaps could give you a roadmap as to a potential destination that we're trying to reach, which is quite acceptable. Let me see now. Wednesday, 30th of June, the Minister's Chair, Chief Executive, Housing Executive, advised that he had asked for a forensic investigation to be undertaken into other contractors. Had a request to have a forensic investigation into the original company, which I think was Red Sky, been undertaken at that stage?
Yes,
It had been.
by the housing executive.
By the Housing Executive. But the Housing Executive, of its own volition, had it decided to have a forensic investigation into the other companies, or did that come from the Minister?
That came from the Minister.
Right. Would there have been a possibility that, I'm just thinking out loud, that at some stage in the future, when contracts became available, people with the experience, people with the structures perhaps bought from an administrator, actually have gone forward with a clear record in terms of being in a position to accept or tender for new contracts, and other companies that were under investigation might not be able to do so, or would that not have been taken into account?
It's a complex question, and again, I would defer to someone who would know more than me about it, but from what you've described and what we've indicated, whether or not you were under investigation wouldn't have any bearing on whether or not you could apply for a new contract in relation to the existing contracts that were in place.
And there was also some discussion that Mr Allister referred to about extending the contract for a period of 6 months initially. And they then come back, I think, through the SPAD, wanting to reduce that to 4 months. Was there any particular reason why? What's the difference between 6 months and 4 months?
No, I'm sorry, I think you have to ask the SPAD that issue. I mean, it was I don't think it was a request he asked to be passed on.
There are specific references in the papers which actually indicate the difference between 4 months and 6 months.
Okay.
4 months. So it's to do with procurement and timing for awarding new contracts and so on. So it's in your paper, Michael.
Thank you.
Okay, Trevor?
Mine's covered, thanks.
You covered, Trevor?
Yeah, for the minute anyway.
Not that often we get a member who's relinquishes the right to be
I
back.
haven't relinquished my right just at this moment. I
No,
think.
that's not a problem. Fran and Dolores.
Sure, just a couple of questions. One is that the meeting that took place with Red Sky representatives on the 27th of June, you had said that the Minister had been advised that any dealings and around contractual arrangements should be done directly with the housing executive, because it's their thing. Why was it DSD officials at the meeting on the 27th then?
Oh, I mean, just maybe to clarify and to restate, the role of the officials is to provide advice to Minister, which was done on 2 occasions. The role of the officials thereafter is to support the Minister in his decision. He decided to attend the meeting. Officials support their ministers at meetings, and we provide the appropriate advice, plus we attended.
But even although you advised them that the meeting should go ahead?
Yes. That would be very common.
very common issue.
The other question, and I thought I picked up at the start of this thing, well, that it says that once you advise the minister that you would advise against the meeting. Did the minister go directly to the housing executive, or the SPAD go directly to the housing, or was it all done through DSD officials?
So this is the meeting of the 27th? Yeah. That would have been done through the...
Yes, once the decision was taken to hold a meeting, and a meeting was put in the Minister's diary, then briefing would have been requested in the normal manner, which means it would have come to Housing Division to provide briefing for the meeting. We would have sought input, as we did, directly from the Housing Executive, to provide us with an up-to-date position, which was all included in the brief provided.
See, given and some of the information we have, I think it goes back as far as 2001, that Red Sky was in existence under a different name then. I think it was an amalgamation of 3 companies that formed Red Sky. Would that not have, I'm just trying to get my head around it, would that not have raised considerations, or should that not have raised considerations and concerns when they were going for a major contract? I think it actually was serious problems in the Shankill area that the former company was in.
I mean, as I say, that's quite a historical aspect, and I don't know the industry well enough.
Believe me,
I there's quite a lot
the
of
information that we've got is historical anyway. That goes back quite a
I mean,
bit.
but I mean, I think that's, I mean, say the experts in the housing sector are the ones who will do this process and will be able to best advise how they handle contracts of this sort.
Well, let's bring it forward then. I think it says in the briefing that you have given us that it spoke about the housing executive, and that it was open to Red Sky to take legal action over the refusal of the withdrawal of the contracts. And I'm just trying to get my head around why then, if that was the case and they didn't take legal action, obviously they're admitting that there is a problem there. And that way then, would the minister or the SPAD or whoever else then be asking the housing executive to withdraw their contracts?
Well, I mean, I think I'd say you have the advice exactly what the minister did ask on the 1st of July, which was a somewhat different issue about extending issue about the question of transferring it to other contractors' issues process. So he wasn't asking, that was the. I think it's a slightly different aspect he was asking in that case.
I think it's also important to reflect the issue that officials were pursuing and providing the Vice Minister on is how he gets assurance in relation to other contractors. The extension of the contract was with Red Sky Administration, and the company and administration has a specific activity, which is to maximise any returns to creditors. So it was quite clear the extension request was for the administrator. If they could run the company, it wasn't for any new company or Red Sky as it existed.
The meeting of the 27th was Red Sky representatives. Was there any of them part of the two, part of the new company?
I said the minutes, the titles assigned to the attendees were the titles given in the invitation request. At the meeting, it's quite clear these were people who had been involved in Red Sky, and they also made it clear they wished to establish a new company and acquire, I think, elements of previous Red Sky.
Okay, Dolores.
Thanks, Chair. And just to look a bit at the chronological events, really the issue around Red Sky came about through a whistleblower and the Northern Ireland Audit Office involvement, and then ASM Haworth. So there was independent factual evidence presented to the Board of the Housing Executive, which resulted in a decision to terminate the Red Sky contract. That's correct understanding. Then we have this series of correspondence requesting the meeting with the Minister, which we have been discussing. And then I believe I'm right in saying that an annual contract of Red Skies was worth some £7 million. That was found in the report. Annual contract of £7 million.
Yes, that's probably right.
And the Northern Ireland Audit Office, or the report of Haworth, discovered an overpayment of £1 million. Now, I don't know if that was a £1 million overpayment in one annual year or not. I'm not sure about that. any be able to throw light
I
on?
wouldn't have the detail of those particular.
But potentially that could, well, we could maybe seek clarification on
I
that.
think the memorandum does give some facts and figures around the ultimate overpayment pursued, which I think was in the region of about 600,000. But the details of that would be with the housing executive.
But there's a difference between pursued and an actual, as we know.
Well, my understanding, again, I could be incorrect, was that the final figure determined by the housing executive, because, again, I'm not clear of it, but I think the ASM report for the housing executive did a sample and then said, well, if this sample is extrapolated, it would be Y. And then the housing executive's own teams did much more detailed analysis and came up with the figure that was put to Red Sky as being owed, which I think is in the region of 600.
Have you any idea how much Red Sky paid back?
The memorandum as well, and I can't go into detail, but I'm fairly certain it's in the memorandum, details the amount that was to be recouped, and also the amount that was repaid and the amount that was written off because it couldn't be recouped. I haven't got the figures, but
No, I mean, we'll look those out, but I was just wondering, did Red Sky go into administration without having paid any of the monies that was overpaid?
be a matter for the housing executive.
We'll pick that up with them. So then, on the basis of the evidence, which was independently verified, and the Audit Office and ASM Haworth, this meeting was established against your better advice. The Minister went ahead against your own advice with this meeting. And the Minister, in the run-up to the meeting, he and his colleagues cried foul and tried to distort the reason for the Red Sky termination as sectarian, and that people in West Belfast, Chair, because of their concerns about the roof falling in on top of them, a pregnant woman, I think, in one episode, and for the fourth time, never mind the historic and widespread failings of Red Sky right across the city. So, at this meeting, according to the minutes of the meeting, the Minister, could you tell me whether or not the Minister in the pre-brief was given the same understanding that I have, that there was independent, factual, evidence-based concerns rightly being addressed by the Housing Executive Board, which was around poor workmanship or overcharging, or even a block of flats that didn't exist having been billed for. So therefore, did you get a sense that the Minister, after having listened to Red Sky's poor me approach and the victimisation that they tried to establish for themselves, did you get any sense that the Minister took account of the glaring facts as opposed to the accusations and false allegations by his colleagues in relation to why the Red Sky contract was terminated?
Well, maybe just to
We
clarify.
try to keep this discourse as less subjective as possible and stick to.
Can I just clarify?
The honest one,
Main question.
should never,
Briefings.
should never stray off.
The briefings provided to the Minister, updating him on the position in relation to the contracts, are very comprehensive, and the committee has those briefings, which go back through the history and the rationale. And
So the Minister would be fully aware of the
decisions
evidence
taken.
trail?
Perhaps not the extensive level of detail that you've quoted, and a lot of that only came out in the NIAO report, which was post-dated this. But yes, the background and leading up to the termination was fully marked in the briefing. What I can
The
say,
Haworth report was established,
the House report was not
established before,
Yes, but it was, the Minister did not have the House report. That was a housing
in advance of
executive
this meeting,
report. No, that was a housing executive's report.
and he didn't have any knowledge of it either?
Oh, sorry, we knew about it. What I think, James, you have the records of exactly our written briefing. I think that's the best way of recording what the department was saying at the time. I don't think it's possible for us to remember what was said in the pre-briefing.
No, that's fair enough.
You
That's
know,
okay.
but I think you've got a very full record of what.
Because honest one, Michael, I know, don't worry.
And I suppose the other point I would just make is that
There's some chittering here, but-
what officials were asked to pursue and have been pursuing was, we were not asked to pursue issues regarding the termination of the Red Sky contract. We were asked to pursue how assurances could be found that the issues that had led to the termination of the Red Sky contract were not present among contractors. We were not asked that, in relation to people mentioned moving the Red Sky, it was extending the administrators' oversight whilst similar investigations took place of other contractors. But we weren't There was no challenge to any of the information presented on Waste Red
But
Sky.
there was a view, and there is a view, that the other contractors have now been brought into this scenario in order to cover up and to muddy, or to muddy the waters.
Stage Lewis, try and stick to
Well-
sort of factual-based questions, if you don't mind.
Well, okay, Chair, I'm interested in, Chair, in terms of July in 2011, whenever the then chairman of the Housing Executive wrote to the Permanent Secretary asking him to step back. What does that mean? Why?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's somewhat strange. I must admit, you have to ask the chair of the housing. I think I received that letter. I think there was a concern that I think, and as you see it in the letter to the minister, about moving to a direction, etc., about that thing. And I think in that letter I see a chairman who is very concerned about the issue. He sends a letter to me. I write back, I think, in the end of August. In fact, I met him beforehand and explained the situation with him. The end of August explained, no, I'd given advice, and actually you see my advice. Obviously, I couldn't share my advice with the chair of the Housing Executive time, because that's not the role of. But I've been giving advice, and I don't know why he felt that I was going beyond my bound in that issue, because I think I was trying to explain very carefully what was being asked of this issue. I had a separate meeting with him on the 4th of September just to make sure, 4th of July, to make sure he understood exactly the limits, to reassure him about the nature. It wasn't a direction, it was a request to look at this issue. And something, of course, the Housing Executive does look at that issue, and it comes back very clearly saying it's impossible because of the administrator not being able to continue. But I think, I say, the letter came somewhat of a surprise to me, but on the other hand, it was a very tense time. A lot of tension around in the process, and maybe just maybe I got a bit of a backwash on that issue.
But just one thing, I know the officials are quite right to point out that it's their role to give advice and support. But as the Permanent Secretary, is it not a responsibility also to be like that bulwark between what is something that a minister isn't doing the right thing in terms of the public interest and the Nolan principles? And, where do you resort to? I mean, if you're pushed down put in an invidious position, what can you do?
I mean, clearly if my minister asks me to do something, or is doing something illegal, or something breaking public account finances, I have a duty to make that point to ministers, okay? But, sorry, the minister has to be responsible for, action. I give advice, but I am not, nobody expects Permanent Secretaries to be the sort of minders who kind of control ministers. You would not expect that of civil servants. It's a political act.
And then, if a minister refuses to accept your advice, have you any sort of safety net, in terms of reporting it to the head of the civil service? I'm just curious as to how this.
Well, okay. Sorry. If a minister asks me to do something in public money, which I feel I cannot justify, I have a formal position of writing, asking for a personal direction. Personal direction is given to me, and then I will notify the Minister of Finance, and I also notify the Controller and Auditor General. And sorry, may I say, directions are often given for very good reasons too. They are for political needs of issues where I can't find value for money, but where there may be good political reasons. So you have to be careful in what you say about directions. But on this, if there's an issue of moral issue or some issue like that, I suppose I would obviously, these questions, but I would, one might talk to the head of the civil service, but sorry, and this is an issue, advice was given, clearly, minister made his decision.
And that was the end of the matter?
The process went through, and actually, of course, in the end, the minister concludes and does not, the contracts are terminated on the date chosen.
Could I?
Yeah, go ahead. No, that's okay, go ahead.
No, I mean, just because it actually follows on from that, it's a question actually, Will, to yourself and to Michael, because, and the flow on, and it's all around the 5th of July, which is obviously another frenetic couple of days, by the record. And it really is opposed to a question of your own respective roles, because the chair of the Housing Executive had written to the minister, advising the minister of his concerns about the minister's actions in this matter. Did you not share the chairs, because obviously you did in terms of the briefings you provided to the minister, do you not share the view that if you didn't act, or rather the minister didn't act appropriately, then, it would actually, contravene your obligations as the, in terms of managing public money? And before I bring on, because these two questions are linked, and it's the same thing for Michael, because again, you, according to the record, contacted Brian Roundtree with the views of the SPAD. Now, clearly in your own advice, that contradicted the advice that you were given to the minister about any prospect of modifying or seeking to modify or change contractual arrangements between the housing executive and any contractor. Now, it seems to me in reading these reports, both yourselves either acquiesced in giving advice to the minister, or perhaps you didn't at some point. So really what I want to know here is, in both circumstances where it involved the chair and the chief executive of the housing executive basically telling you they had these concerns about the minister's and the SPA's involvement, but you still continued on working with the minister and working with the SPAD on that basis. In Michael's own case, you had actually went to Brian Roundtree, I think, with an email, putting to him this business around the 4 months as opposed to 6 months. Could I suggest to you that that would certainly be a potential modification of a contract, which would be outside the legal advice? So
Well,
just give me a second or two to remember to come back on that one.
Yeah, of
Will
course,
yourself
absolutely.
or-
I mean, Chairman, I think if you read my advice to the Minister of the 1st of July, I think it's very clear what I'm saying in my position here, and I think we'd actually started very clearly that position was today. And then my advice, once we got the letter of the 5th, you'll see my submission to the Minister of the 6th of July. It makes absolutely clear my position, and the Minister, of course, follows that and agrees that the decision is absolutely clear about my position on public money, etc. So you have it in the record. Obviously, I've had to. There's bits of legal advice which I can't share with you, but you'll see from those minutes very clearly. I mean, I'll let Michael come on the issue, but can I just make one? He will answer on that issue. But the one issue is the key issue that the housing executive was addressing rightly on the 5th was the minister's letter, which said 6 months, and was the request that Michael, if I understand right, and I only heard it subsequently. I mean, he was asked to pass on. It was a request from the SPAD to ask of the administrator. So it was asking the housing executive to ask the administrator, if it was 4 months, would the administrator's position be different? So it was, but the key bit was the housing executive was looking at, and its board was being asked to look at this issue. So, I mean, I think that's, I just wanted, but Michael, you want to comment?
Yes, Chair, that's correct. The Housing Executive Board was being held that day. As you rightly say, and we have explained, I think, in the briefing why the letter changed from 80 days to 8 weeks to the 6 months and then back again to the 4 months. It was a request to say if, in fact, that 6 months did seem quite long, and we had taken advice from CPD in relation to the length of time that it would take to undertake a procurement exercise. So it was we were reducing the actual period, but it had already been changed twice.
But given the concerns expressed formally by the housing executive, and you're well aware that it was actually their legal responsibility, not yours, or the department's, that given the expressed views of the chief executive and the chair of the housing executive, did you think it was appropriate for you then to pass on, if you like, a question from the SPAD? And if you did you discuss that with any of your other senior officials? Because it would certainly seem to me, in reading that, that would have been an inappropriate action, because that borders very clearly on seeking to modify an existing contract. And that's, by the way, and the reason I'm addressing that was that's the term of reference we're addressing here this afternoon.
With the passage of time, Chairman, I can't remember if I did discuss it. This happened at 7:30 in the morning, whenever the approach was made from SPAD. I think, I did check with him, I can't honestly remember, but we sent off because we needed to make that approach before the board meeting.
But why would you need to make an approach when you knew it was against the advice that you had previously given to the minister? It just strikes me as, because we're trying to get to the bottom of where the fault actually lies here, because clearly there was fault, we know that.
Sure.
So
maybe
just before you bring in the second Jim, but I'm just trying to establish that with Michael, because I would suggest if you get a phone call or whatever at 7:30 in the morning, it mightn't happen that often, maybe it's every morning, I don't know.
Well,
But,
you can down dash to see me in my room.
okay, and you can't recall if you had discussed it with anybody else after that? But
I
you did
honestly
forward it
can't.
on to
No.
the housing executive?
No, I can't remember. I may have done, but I can't honestly remember if I did or
And
not.
if you may have done, could you speculate who you may have contacted?
No, I can't remember. I really can't.
Would it be the door person in Lighthouse Building, or would it be the permanent secretary, would it be Jim?
It would have been above my pay grade.
And who would that be then?
Line management would it be?
Could you name who they are, because maybe for the record?
Can't remember.
Can't remember who the line managers are?
No, I can't remember if I spoke to someone. I said I may have
I
done.
no, appreciate that. But I'm wondering, trying to work out, it would have been somebody above you, so there can't be that many people above you.
No, I mean, it would be the line of command is
It's just that we may
sitting
people
on
to
this
ask
table.
those individuals if they can recall.
So the chain of command is along this table, so I.
Okay, sorry, at some time I heard about the issue. I mean, I think that the board, whether it was that day or after the board had met, I don't know when I heard. I mean, I wasn't there at 7:30 in the morning, I don't think. But the key point for myself, I mean, this issue, I mean, I didn't understand why this request had gone in the process, but the answer was the issue was the letter from the minister was the key issue here. And I say you need to ask.
But can I interpret from what you've just said there, Will, is then that you didn't think it was the right thing to do would be to contact the minister on the back of the request from SPOD?
What I didn't understand was why it was. I mean, the minister set out a request for 6 months, and I just that was what the board was looking at, and I didn't understand it. Okay.
But I mean, I think it's a fairly serious enough comment to make it, fair enough. I mean, we can only deal with what you can recall and what you're actually giving evidence to this committee on. But what I'm inferring from what you're saying is that it certainly was flagged in your mind it was an unusual thing to do. Okay. Michael, you were looking at a small point, and Jim, Olive, you're looking back in again?
It's just a couple of small points. In the meeting that took place on the 30th of June 2011, reference was made to a meeting that took place just 2 days earlier with the Minister, the Chair of the Housing Executive, in that following receipt of further information from the Housing Executive in respect of concerns with another contractor. The Minister had no other choice really than to request a forensic investigation. Could I ask you who was present at the meeting, insofar as you're aware, on the 28th of June 2011, what issues were discussed? And could I also then ask if any of the contractors that were referred to as contractors in the meeting of June the 30th resurfaced later on in terms of being included by name in the ministerial statement we spoke about this morning?
Okay. Right. Jim, I think it's
As again, I think just to add some context, there were a variety of meetings taking place over this time. Some were minuted, some were ad hoc, and some weren't. And it is recollection rather than confirmation, and it's looking at diaries. I believe there was a meeting on the 28th that was attended by the Chair and Acting Chief Executive of the Housing Executive. I think I was present and possibly Michael was present, where the Minister posed questions and said, are there issues, are there issues about other contractors who may have difficulties? And I think he also maybe posed a question as, and what does this mean for the Housing Executive side? Is there issues on how the Housing Executive manage contracts? Has there been any disciplinary matters? And I think at that stage, the Chair said, yes, there is other company and has been disciplinary action.
And one other company or several?
I can't recall, but what I do know is that subsequent to that, the information that was provided by the Housing Executive and recorded in the briefing for the meeting on the 30th was obviously the Housing Executive's response to that verbal meeting, and here they said, here's the information on another contractor we're looking at, and here's some information on disciplinary procedures.
Well, it said contractors on the 30th. It was contractor on the 28th, contractors on the 30th. That's my understanding.
Yes, I think.
So what I'm asking, did any of those companies, were any of those companies named, and was there any correlation between companies named on the 30th of June or suspected on the 30th of June and those subsequently mentioned in the ministerial statement 10th of June some years later?
No.
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 okay.
I was just just going to remind yourself there, Michael, and others, just the record, I'm just been reminding myself, the 4 named contractors were plant maintenance. We're dealing with
Yeah,
plant
I
maintenance.
understand, but they didn't perform any of those duties, no?
Sorry, were some of the plan maintenance contractors responsible maintenance contractors? Again, you can check, I think they might have been. Well, I could check your, Housing Executive will know more about that than I would. But none of them were in the named, and the Minister got additional information about investigations, none of those companies were.
Okay.
Okay, Jim Allister.
Just a couple of things, but to pick up on the point the Chairman was asking you about, Mr. Sand. The email, 5th of July at 7:40 in the morning, is from you to Maria McLaughlin. It actually opens with Brian. Who were you addressing?
She is his PA.
Right, okay. And Brian who?
I had Brian Roundtree.
And Roundtree, right, so is the Chairman. Now, if you were asked at 7:30 by the SPAD to do this, and you sent the email at 7:40, one thing we can induce is, if there was consultation with anyone else, it was very short. But certainly we've been furnished with no other emails which suggest you emailed anyone else about it.
I could have spoken to him.
You did CC Mr. Wilkinson into it, but you still can't remember who you might have spoken to. No. Mr. Hare, you had given very clear and appropriate advice against an Article 10 direction. It was quite clear that was in the Minister's mind. He took your advice, but it's quite clear that was in his mind. Is that fair?
I think there's a reference in the text which to say you had mentioned, I think in one of my submissions it says you had mentioned the issue of it, so it must have come up in that discussion.
Yes. And then he desisted from that. But with the board meeting coming up on the 5th of July, is there some evidence that a different tack was then approached, namely that of seeking to canvass opinion on the board?
Sorry, I'm not aware of, I'm not, other than,
Were you not aware of the statements by Councillor Jenny Palmer, that she was lobbied by Mr. Brimstone?
Sorry, I'm obviously aware of that, in fact, that happened in process, but I'm not aware of, I wasn't aware of any sort of discussion about it. There's no issue about is there approach to the border, etc.
Well, could I just ask you, would it be okay or would it be wrong for a civil servant to seek to lobby an executive board member to change their position?
Sorry, it was not certainly something a civil servant would not do, and it was not. It's
Not something you would expect a civil servant to do.
No, sorry, if a minister had asked in some situation to ask, for information to go to the process, the answer was to go to the chairman with information and say, here's the position of the minister. But the position as officials is.
Yes. But of course, a SPAD is a civil servant, temporary civil servant,
It's a particular
subject to the same obligations.
And he obviously there's issues which I'm sure you will explore with the
Well, to
individual.
help us explore those,
About this question about deviling on behalf of
Yes.
the party and all those issues which are in.
If I could just make a point, sorry, Jim, I don't want to be interrupting your flow there, but these things are difficult, except people are in awkward positions. People are working with other people, working with colleagues, working with ministers, advisors, and all these relationships are sometimes difficult and fraught with tension, and that's some of that's healthy and important. But what's very clear here, if you're being asked questions, you need to just give the answer as clear as you precisely can do.
Yes.
Regardless of relationships or anything else. We have to set all of that to one side, even though we're continuing to work with the same individuals. But we have a job of work to do here, and we expect us to be professional in our manner of questioning, and we expect everybody else to be professional in their responses.
Yeah. Now, we do know that you instigated a fact-finding investigation. Has that been concluded?
Materials, that issue is concluded. The Minister is writing to this committee on this issue.
Are you not going to answer the question?
The fact-finding was has been concluded this
When
year.
was it concluded?
That was concluded in the last year, was concluded last year, sorry.
In the autumn of last year?
Issue has been, say, that's why, then
And where's it been since?
the issue has been an issue which has been considered in Parliament and with the Minister.
Has it resulted in any disciplinary or intended disciplinary proceedings?
That's an issue for the Minister is going to reply to committee.
You're avoiding that question.
It is an issue for the Minister to reply.
No, you're the head of the, you're the permanent secretary. You have personnel responsibilities for civil servants in your department,
That is.
of which Mr. Brimstone is one.
The issue, I think the Minister's letter will explain the situation.
And when will, after the matter being with the department since last year, when will the committee see the minister's letter?
I would hope you get it in the next day or so. He did, publicly, I think he committed to reply to you, to reply to the, him within the 10 days, and I think that's up today. And,
Well, I think the committee's been pushing for it for a lot longer than 10 days. And I think individual MLAs, myself included, have been writing to you a lot longer than 10 days.
Indeed,
I think you have correspondence with me reaching over a year ago.
indeed.
Yes. So the department has been sitting on this for a year.
The issue has been an issue which, as I say, the Minister has been considering.
What is it you're trying to conceal from the public in respect of the fact-finding investigation?
Sorry, the Minister will reply on this issue. It's an issue for the Minister. The Minister.
It's clear, Jim, that Will is not going to go beyond that, but what I would suggest you do is that obviously this committee has been, on behalf of the whole committee, has been corresponding with the department for over the last year on this matter, and we've had a variety of responses. So what I would suggest you do, you reflect on those responses. Because there has been a number of responses issued to us throughout the year, which we have as part of our correspondence and part of this folder. So I'm just simply reminding people that this is an inquiry. It will get to the bottom of these matters as long as it takes. And as I'm simply saying, there is a trail of correspondence between ourselves and the department throughout this last several months. And that's a matter of public record, so I would just simply ask yourself to reflect on that, because it just doesn't simply relate to the documents or the report is with the Minister since last September, I understand, as last confirmed to ourselves. So I just simply say I would like you to reflect on that, because we will return to the litany of correspondence that we have.
Could I just make this point to you, Mr. Hare, that it's part of the area that this committee has to investigate the actions or whatever it was Mr. Brimstone did or didn't do and say. Do you agree it could potentially be of assistance to this committee to know what the fact-finding operation produced?
I suppose the question is explaining it. I think the answer is, I think the answer probably is, you will want to ask the Minister about that.
I want to ask the Minister, but I want to ask you. You set it up.
It sets out, the point of fact finding is to find out the facts. And
If you set it up, the report was back to you,
Yeah,
wasn't it?
It is a personnel report, is an issue in that process.
Yes, and Mr. Brimstone's one of your personnel.
The issue is how that fits in the role of the SPAD and how it fits into the departmental.
But they're not above the ethic requirements of the department, are they?
And the issue is, of course, who makes judgments on the issues of the ethics.
And you've told us already you would regard it as unacceptable if a civil servant were to try to lobby members of the Housing Board.
Well, sorry, it's not a rule for civil servants to lobby. The question, of course, I'm saying is there's an issue which the Minister explained about special advisor and the role of the deviling role of the special advisor. That's the issue.
Let me ask you one other thing finally. In the discovery that we have received from the BBC, there is correspondence back to Mr. Thornton from Grania McConnell, who's a civil servant in your department. And it refers to you making a reference to the Northern Ireland office pertaining to Mr. Roundtree. When was that done?
I can't remember the date. It was near that time. It was a separate issue at the time.
It was about this time.
It was, I think, some around that time.
Yes.
Yeah,
Mr. Rowntree had written to you at the beginning of July. You took exception to some of the things he wrote, isn't that right?
So the issue here is a totally different issue.
Yes, I'm just trying to get the chronology.
Yeah.
You took exception to some of the things he wrote to you, is that right?
He wrote to me at, so I think this was at the 25th of June.
Right, okay.
So it was before that time?
Okay.
2 years later.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
It's actually 2 years
It
later.
was 2 years later, sorry.
Sorry, what's 2 years later?
Sorry, the issue of,
The letter, the note from Gronau to the BBC.
Yes.
It was 2 years after the letter.
Yeah.
Lying to you.
Yes, but I'm back in 2011.
Yeah,
In
so-
2011, in or about the beginning of July, Mr. Rowntree wrote to you in terms to which you took exception. Is that fair?
well, sorry, I had to put on record my
Yes,
disagreement with
yes.
him, but as I say, and as you'll see from his correspondence, it was perfectly,
Accepted.
he accepted my point.
Where in date time order was you referring to the Northern Ireland office, his holding of the position of chairman of the Civil Service Commissioners? When did you do that?
Sorry, I think this was been in, it must have been in June 2013, I think. So it was,
No, I don't
sorry, it was
think
before
so.
it was before the Red Sky, 2012.
Well, I think, sorry,
Yeah.
I think we need to check, but I'm
Yeah.
almost certain this was following an internal report from the Housing Bureau,
Yeah.
which was received in 13.
Yes. Sorry,
Well, you can
apologies.
confirm to us, I'm sure, when that happened, can you?
I will come back to you on that in the process, but I think there's quite distance in time. Yeah. They're two very separate issues in the process. Separate
And
time.
I don't want really to go into that issue, but why were you doing that?
Sorry, there was an issue had come up in relation to something within the housing executive and information, and there is a requirement in one of the PAC reports said in a public appointment, if you see something that needs to be answered by a public appointee, you need to, if they are in another public department, it's your duty to make them aware, the other department, if there's something which the department, that new department needs to be aware of. Right? And I felt there was an issue which Mr. Rowntree had not answered within the Housing Executive on a very different, say nothing to do with Red Skull, which had to be answered. And I felt in the light that it was my duty to tell the Housing Executive, the NIO, that needed to look at that issue. I also felt it was my duty also to tell Mr. Rowntree that I was making this reference to him, and that went to the NIO.
Did you think you had the same public duty in respect of a special advisor who might have overstepped the mark in trying to lobby independent members of a housing executive board?
Sorry, I didn't hear. I mean, I subsequently, after the event, when the issue had been solved, did I hear anything about it? When the board had met, that I heard a reference from Brian Rowntree advised me that he had a concern about lobbying issues. This, and but emphasised very much it was a political. It was within the party issue. That whole question of the role of.
So when did Mr. Rowntree advise you his concerns about lobbying?
I heard that sometime a day or so after the event.
And did Mr. Rowntree raise that with you?
He mentioned to me, but indicated nothing needs to be done on my part.
But he told you about it?
He told me about
And
that.
did he identify the lobbyer?
He indicated that he had he gave me a sense of the conversation, which was subsequently, Councillor Palmer, I can't remember the exact words he used, but it's something of that sort had taken place, but it was within the issue of a party issue. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, Trevor?
Thanks, Chairman. I'm sure, Will, you would have listened in, and I'm sure you've followed the proceedings of this committee. It was interesting last week in terms of the Audit Office, in terms of the trend of overcharging, and in terms of how that was recorded. But come back to Dolores' comments, or Miss Kelly's comments earlier, where she suggested ones would have said this was maybe sectarian in terms of the overcharging. How much in terms of Red Sky was the overcharging whenever it was finally calculated? How much was it?
We may have to come back with some of the detail on that.
I think
could
the
give broadly, I think the final figure that was put by the Housing Executive to Red Sky was around the 600,000 mark.
600,000.
That's my understanding, but I'm sure we'll come back with more accurate figures on that.
And you'll be aware then from last week in terms of that office that the Housing Executive didn't start recording, I think, until about 2010 or 2011. But there was a problem with overcharging for many years within the Housing Executive, which has been recognised. I think that's the way it was, to paraphrase what was said last week.
Again, I think the audit officer report into response maintenance identified that there were clear systemic failures that facilitated overcharging.
And I mean, and it's right that those should be addressed, and I mean, no company should be overcharging. But I suppose where some of the suspicions could come that, given there's a systemic failure within that organisation going back many years, that it would raise its head under the leadership of Alex Atwood in terms of the SDLP being the minister of that particular department at that time, and this East Belfast company. So I suppose some could be drawn in terms of the sectarian nature and how this one raised its head. But in terms of the 4 companies more recently, in terms of the overcharging, where a figure of 18 million come up, and some work was done, was the same methodology used in terms of trying to establish how much overcharging was in that contract?
Again, the detail of the methodology applied to assess overcharging would be something more relevant put to the Housing Executive, but I would make the point that the recent overcharging related to planned maintenance.
Well, still, I mean,
response maintenance was a different activity, and I can say in relation
some of us outside the industry could describe it as a blank cheque.
I suppose the issue in relation to response maintenance is that the methodology used by ASM in relation to the Red Sky investigation was exactly the same methodology used by ASM for the forensic investigation subsequently commissioned by the department.
And given the scale of the most recent overcharging, what did the final figure equate to?
Sorry, in relation
The
to
final figure in terms of the overcharging of the most recent case?
In the settlement,
Yeah.
this settlement, I came to those figures with this, wouldn't have, I think, so was it 12 million and then it's 10 million underpaid?
No, 2.7.
2 million.
2 million, okay. And I suppose what...
There's a lot of debate on how these figures are, and I really don't want to go there. Absolutely not. Was
Well, sure, what's 2 million when we're talking about 500,000? So, but I suppose where I'm going in this one is that there's many members, the honourable member even opposite me was very keen to lobby in terms of the companies to make sure that that was brought to a resolution in terms of the overcharging. Was there any calls, or was there any suggestion in those 4 companies that any of those will have their contracts terminated?
Again, as was made quite clear, the contraction management between the Housing Executive and their contractors, I think in relation to those contracts were coming to an end anyway. There's a new contracting process. The issue as well.
So it's acceptable to overcharge. No, it's acceptable to overcharge. Like it's acceptable in those cases for Jim Allister and others to lobby in terms of those contractors.
I was only.
Sorry, folks, hold on a wee second. Just let me.
So you're allowed to badger and I'm not.
We're doing well. We're actually doing quite well. 4-3 and we're long on day, and that's okay, and that's fair enough. And there will be a certain amount of cut and thrust, and everybody expects that. But at the same token, let's try to keep the question, and as long as we need to be here, if many questions people want to ask, they're very free to do that. But let's try and do it on a professional basis, best we can do, because the less subjectivity in people's remarks, then the less need for rebuttals from other members. So all I'm really saying is ask the question and allow time for a response, then ask another question, and that's the way we'll tease it through.
I was only going to make one point, Chair, which was in the evidence provided to the committee, the reasons the board terminated the Red Sky contract was not actually in relation to overpayments. It was relation to their take on how far on their trust and relationship. It didn't actually relate to overpayment figures.
Was there not something in the report in terms of the work was satisfactory?
I think that was one of the
Satisfactory as opposed to unsatisfactory?
and I think we'll be able to
There's a sectarian card coming out again.
you'll be able to explore this.
Hold on, Mr. Brown,
Let's bring out sectarian card again.
McCann, please be quiet. Okay.
as I said, you'll be able to explore this further with the housing executive officials who know exactly the detail of the termination.
No, I mean, I contend that, I mean, if there's overcharging is taking place, I believe that whoever, I mean, it's public money, it should be held to account for it. But I suppose it's consistency. In 2011, a company has been, and its name has obviously been dragged through the quagmire for many, many years, and still is. But it's consistency. But I can understand where it was raised at the time in terms of sectarian attitudes towards that and where the genesis of it all came from.
Okay. Is that,
Yeah, I'll do. Yeah.
I think, Chair, we're all used to distortion
Okay,
of the
just
facts.
that's-
Yeah,
Mayor.
listening to you,
Mr.
Dolores, it's very
Clark.
easy to get distortion.
Trevor?
Well, you know, empty vessels make more
Every time
noise.
you open your mouth, it's
Hold on
distortion.
a second, Trevor. I'm doing okay today, all right? Now, everybody has their opportunity to ask whatever number of questions they need to ask. We're just trying to moderate this a wee bit so that we can get through the business as professionally as we can do. So if you've made your point and asked your question, then let others come in and do likewise. You need to come back in again, just ask and you're brought in.
Chair, I would like to place, though, on record that the comments that I made earlier and the questions were based on the evidence before us, both in Hansard and elsewhere,
Okay.
in terms of how the situation
That's
evolved.
fair enough, and the point's made, so.
And further, just as a matter of record too, Chair, I think we owe a debt of gratitude to Minister Atwood for initiating investigations on the back of evidence and concerns raised. Going back to what my question really was, can I just ask, obviously the Red Sky contract was terminated. Can I ask then what happened to those contracts? Were they reissued or retendered? Maybe it might be a housing executive matter.
It's best to ask that. I mean, obviously there was an entire tendering exercise, but you've got the experts coming
Well, I
to.
think the outstanding work was assigned to adjacent contractors and member officials or workers to be across where appropriate. I think that's actually what happened.
Okay.
Because we're nearing the end of those particular contracts.
And can I just ask then, given the fact that the concerns were raised and an independent inquiry and investigation presented to the housing sector which resulted in a decision to terminate the contract, would you regard that as appropriate action by one of your arm's reach or independent organisations?
I'm totally, it was totally within their power and right, and I understood. I mean,
And it was the right thing to do?
If that's what they found as evidence, I totally support them.
Thank you. And do you then share my concerns that on that basis that the Minister sought to overturn what was appropriate action by the Housing Executive based on evidence and contrast that to how he treated other contractors?
Sorry, the Minister put a request, a specific request, which was not
Don't worry,
by
I'll come to
overturning,
the-
but the
back
point
to-
is, I think we are on record.
I'll come back to the Minister.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, we have a couple of, I think, minor interventions, I hope, Michael. and then
Jim, you mentioned a figure in relation to Red Sky of about 600,000. Was that net including any compensation events that had been factored into it, or was that the gross amount?
Again, I trust you'll get a more detailed and knowledgeable answer from colleagues from the Housing Executive. My understanding how response maintenance worked and their attempt to recoup was they would identify the payment and then recoup it from monies due in relation to other work, and then you get a net figure, and I'm sure they'll be able to give you more detail about how that was attempted to be recovered.
Future.
Okay, Michael, thank you. From last round.
There was a couple of points. One, I think you had said that procedures done back then facilitated possibly overcharging in terms of response maintenance when you were talking was actually about Red Sky. But the question I wanted to ask, and it's in and around the termination of the Red Sky contract and the Minister ordering a forensic investigation and review into response maintenance. I think what was the outcome of the forensic review? Did it find that the water companies involved in are overcharging pure maintenance records, and what happened to them companies if there was?
Again, I mean, the the findings of that forensic investigation were provided to the committee, and they were given a copy of what's referred to as the ASM
Just want you to remind me about it.
to report. It did find elements, it did find aspects of overpayment, and the scale is.
Did they lose their contracts?
I think, just to sort of maybe give a bigger picture for the whole response maintenance contract environment, the response maintenance contracts were all up for recontracting anyway, so it was a different process, so there was no contract stopped. So by the time the ASM2 came in, the new procurement exercise had commenced to secure the new contractors. So they were part of a new, by the time the report was published and provided, those contracts are going on. But the housing executive took the ASM2 report, which identified elements of overpayment, but more importantly, identified the causes of overpayment as things that still had to be addressed. And those causes had featured in the work the housing executive already was doing to improve response maintenance. So the ASM2 report, in effect, said yes, there were elements of overpayment, quantums were different, issues that caused overpayments were the same, and the measures that needed to be taken to be addressed were very similar, and already work was progressing. The report is published and is with the committee. In relation to whether any of those contractors feature in the new contracts, I think that the housing will be provided information and advice on that.
Okay, to see on that point, let's go back to the Red Sky contract. I take it the Red Sky contract was terminated also because of the poor maintenance record in many areas.
That would be a matter, again, the housing will give you the full detail of why it's contracted. We knew it was terminated. I think there's a form of wording and exact form of wordings in the memorandum.
But again, it's not particularly relevant to the phase 3 issue that we have of a term of reference which we're dealing with, so we're not reinvestigating or examining the nature of contracts and so on.
I understand that, Chair, but as part of the evidence today, it also said that the Minister had said that there were a number of our companies that they wanted to carry out a forensic review on the thing. See the information provided the Minister, and I take it that the information to kick-start that came from Red Sky because they were making complaints?
No, I think, and again, in some of the information provided, there was a whole series of information. So the Minister was briefed about the issues which had given rise to the termination of the Red Sky contract,
Red Sky,
including failings. He was advised of the governance review, which had identified potential failings, and he was aware of the qualifications of the audit office. So there were a whole raft of issues. In addition, the housing executive alerted him to that there were at least one other contractor and that there were significant disciplinary matters. So it was a portfolio of information.
Okay, no other member indicating to speak on this matter for now. On that basis, is there anything, Will, or any of your colleagues want to say, just for the record? If not, then fine, but we'll certainly be very keen to take any response from the back of something that comes to mind afterwards. And again, just because this is an open inquiry, then we may want to revisit some of the matters we've raised today. So it's a two-way process. Please feel free to come back to us at any time if you want to correct or add anything. And we'll do likewise. Okay, so thanks very much for your attendance here this afternoon. Okay, members, we're moving into the next session, or the next section of this particular. Okay, can I formally welcome yourself to the, with John McVeigh, Declan Allen, Clark Bailey and Raymond Kitson. Formally welcome yourselves here to the meeting this afternoon. And thank you for your patience. I know you've been here for a few hours. Could advise members that the number of written submissions provided on pages 336, 342 and 347 of your packs. And obviously, again, as I said earlier on there, the John, Declan, Clark and Raymond, we're here as part of phase 3 of the committee's inquiry, and we've asked yourselves to provide a briefing on investigations into housing executive contractors, including Red Sky. Again, I just want to remind people that we're not actually rehearsing particular contracts or the nature of them or why they were terminated. Suffice to say that there were in some cases and others were continually reviewed and so on. So we have very specific terms of reference, and again, I'm just reminding people that you have given submissions. If you want to make any opening remarks, any one of you or all of you, make any opening remarks.
Perhaps falls to me, Chairman.
Okay, Clark.
Thank you for the invitation to come along today. I'm Clark Bailey. I was invited as the Director of Corporate Services. Feel obliged to advise the committee. I was acting Director of Corporate Services for about 8 months, from February to September 2011, when Stuart Cuddy was acting Chief Executive. My substantive role is Director of Finance, and I've been Director of Finance since December 2007, when I joined the Housing Executive from the Health Service. You've asked me and my colleagues a range of questions, which reflects our different engagement and roles in the process that you're currently investigating. Just quickly, colleague in the, I was going to say the extreme right, that's not an appropriate phrase in this building. My colleague to my right is John McVeigh, who is Head of our Audit and Assurance Unit. Then Declan Allen, who's our Head of Procurement, and then Raymond Kitson, gentleman to my right, who is the Manager of the Repairs Inspection Unit, which now falls within John's Audit and Assurance Unit. We've submitted a briefing which hopefully addresses the questions you've asked us, and rather than go back and go over that in further detail, can I suggest that we will respond to whatever questions you have and try and answer them as best we can?
Okay, Clark, thanks very much for that. Again, members will have the submissions in front of them. So, okay, members. Jim, Alistair, you want to?
Yeah, I have some questions.
Really afterwards.
Just picking up on a point that you probably heard raised with the last witnesses, the Minister required an examination of the potential replacement contractors for Red Sky, of how they'd conducted themselves. Would you just remind us, I think it is in your brief, could you just remind the committee what the findings were in respect of those contractors?
I wasn't personally involved in ASM2. I'm not sure which of my colleagues would be best placed to respond to that.
Well, it's probably Raymond, in the sense that they just give him a chance to sort of get his thoughts together. But the time that the ASM2 review was being carried out, the repair inspection unit had moved over to a different area of business. It was at one stage attached to the internal audit department, which I had headed up at that stage. RIU had moved to a unit at that stage called the Corporate Assurance Unit, and Raymond's team's role, they were invited to assess some of the work which the ASM Hearth team had produced, and to allow Housing Executive to respond to the data which ASM Hearth had collated. So, Raymond.
Yes, I am quite happy to continue on there. The Director of Housing Regeneration at that time, now the Landlord Services, requested ourselves and Repairs Inspection Unit to undergo a quality assurance exercise because there was concerns arising from the actual findings. The districts and the Central Maintenance Unit within the Housing Executive had concerns that perhaps some of the findings weren't appropriate to be recovering money where certain elements of work was actually completed, albeit may not be fully to our satisfaction, but nonetheless was partly completed. So we were asked to conduct an exercise, 20% exercise of the findings. That we did, and we found in that exercise that there was certain concerns regarding some of the findings. We produced a report that would suggest that 38% of the findings were basically to exaggerating the overcharging to a point. So we revised that position to where we believed was the more appropriate. Of the 20% we looked at, it summed to around £9,000 odd, the amount of work. The districts, however, conducted a complete review of all of the jobs.
So you said 9,000. Was the ASM figure not 9,000? Or your figure was 3,500?
Our figure, the revised figure was 3,500, yes.
Yes, so the final figure that emerged from this was £3,500.
Of our 20% check. Only of our 20% check.
Yes, I understand.
But I would say that the district's review actually would suggest it was somewhere around 50% less than what the ASM figures would have been. And of reflection, that's what my understanding the recovery was.
So, like, obviously any overcharging is wrong.
Correct.
And shouldn't be happening. But in the scale of things, the Minister had concerns about these further companies, but the actual findings were relatively modest, is that right?
Considering our benchmarks, once we conducted our review, we were asked to do further checks.
Yes.
And the further checks proved that any overcharging, like it's like you say that there shouldn't be any, but we have to be realistic. Errors can happen, and we in the corporate assurance unit have a benchmark of where it's acceptable. We will recover all monies that has been identified as being overpaid. That's without question. But to put them in the same bracket as perhaps other contractors who were substantially being overpaid, then we have to be realistic.
And moving then to Red Sky, what came to a head with Red Sky in 2011 have been the culmination of a number of concerns over a period of years, is that right?
That's correct.
And during those period of years, there have been quite substantial sums identified as alleged overclaims.
We had concerns with Red Sky and Spectrum before that for quite a few years.
Was that running into hundreds of thousands, or what was it?
That was certainly hundreds of thousands, yeah.
And just to jump to the end of it, how much was written off after Red Sky went into liquidation?
All monies that was identified as being overcharged was, my colleague to the right here will confirm this, but any monies was withheld from Red Sky that we actually owed them.
Yes.
So it was a withholding notice that was served on Red Sky that we were actually going to withhold any monies we owed them.
Yes.
So we weren't going to pay them monies whilst they owed us money. So we went in that direction through legal advice.
So you withheld, I think, various periods, you withheld 25,000 a month at one point. And, but in the end, did you not write off a figure of 375,000?
There was an element that we had identified through the work of ASM and the work of Raymond and his team, that in our estimation there were overpayments of around £600,000.
Yes.
And we then instituted a process to deduct those amounts from payments due to the company.
Yes.
However, as members will know, shortly after the decision reached by the Housing Executive Board to terminate the contracts, the company went into administration.
Yes.
And there then followed a series of discussions between the Housing Executive and the Administrator. And we had to concede that we had in fact to pay an amount back to the Administrator. And that was the amount that was written off that you've just referred to.
375. Now, over the years, when figures had been identified as being claimed to be overcharged by Red Sky, there seemed to be a pattern, correct me if I'm wrong, where Red Sky would then come in and sit down with you and barter and negotiate down the figure. Is that a pattern that went on?
It wasn't actually a pattern, but there was an investigation in 2005, 2006,
Yes.
where certainly there was negotiations at the outcome of that figure.
And that was when the figure was, well, remind me what the figure was then?
2006, I think it was 260,000.
And was that eventually bartered down to 20,000?
That's correct.
And who was involved in that?
At the time, the director, former director of Housing Regeneration,
Who was that?
Colin McCauley.
Right. And who was negotiating on behalf of Red Sky?
The chairman of Red Sky.
And who was that?
Mr. Hayes?
That is Frank Cushnan.
Frank Cushnan. And is that the same Frank Cushnan who was criticised in the Public Accounts Committee for his involvement in those negotiations were totally unethical?
I can't comment.
I'm not sure if that's
Or is that
the
the same?
exact language that's used.
Well,
But it's,
I think you will find that in their February 2013 report on the management of housing executive maintenance contracts, the Assembly's Public Accounts Committee said Mr. Cushion's involvement in these negotiations was, quote, totally unethical and could and should have been avoided.
okay.
And was the unethical aspect the fact that he had been a serving member of the Housing Executive's Audit Committee?
I believe he did serve in that post, yes. It's before
And
my
he
time.
progressed from that position to chairman of Red Sky. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
And then negotiated down debts allegedly of the order of something of £250,000 to £20,000. Is that accurate? Is that?
Yes,
That is
that's
accurate,
to the best of our knowledge, yes.
Yes.
And that's something that the housing executive obviously acquiesced in. You were a party to those negotiations, you, the housing executive.
Yes, the housing executive accepted that final outcome.
Does that suggest that Red Sky was a company used to getting its own way with the housing executive?
They were, from the company's perspective, I would suggest that the outcome was favourable to the company. They were successful, and obviously they were able to persuade the members of the housing executive at that time that they had a case. I wasn't personally involved, so I'm trying to conclude on the basis of the information available to us.
But you're also aware there were concerns that Red Sky had complained about certain staff in West Belfast, and the key person against whom they complained was then moved within the housing executive. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that is accurate.
That's accurate.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, was this a company which seemed to believe that it could bring pressure to bear and influence with the housing executive?
In terms of how the company perceived the situation, I obviously can't speak for the company. But from what you have just said, we're not disputing the accuracy of those remarks.
There then was an attempt laterally, all this talk that you might have heard earlier about forming a new company by the same people. Is that right?
I was aware of bits and pieces, but I wouldn't claim to be an expert on this particular matter.
Was anyone involved from the housing executive in discussions with the putative new company about?
To the best of my knowledge, no.
Is that for a moment? Tim?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, I mean, I just want to follow on that there because that pattern that Jim refers to or suggests, I mean, I would ask you to cast your mind off to and give us an opinion on. I mean, the same thing happened in 2007 and 2008 and possibly 2009, if my notes are correct, I may be wrong, certainly 2007, 2008, where Colin McCahley and Paddy McIntyre both again were involved in renewed discussions with Red Sky over contracts and discrepancies around payments. Use my words advisedly. And I think on the third occasion, Mr McIntyre asked people to have a review of that and recalculate the figures. Because for me, reading this, there has been a pattern. And I think what has frustrated this committee for so long is that there doesn't appear to be any personal accountability in all of this. So we have year on year problems identified, whatever they may well be, whatever the contractor, whoever they may well be, but there have been problems identified, and certainly in respect of one contractor, there are a number of issues that have identified, unaddressed, negotiated, renegotiated, and in my reading, at all times to the benefit of the company. That to me is a pattern. familiar pattern, and it's actually quite worrying. So, again, yourselves are involved in investigating it, you have it in your submission. Do you have any comment on that? Because that, to me, is a clear pattern.
I think, Chairman, you're referring to matters which obviously generally predate most of us at this end of the table. I can assure the committee, though, that in terms of in my experience with the Housing Executive, we deal with companies fairly, objectively, and where we believe we have a case to recover overpayments, we pursue that. It's our obligation as a public servant.
I'm not suggesting anything to the contrary, by the way. I'm making a point, but in your submission that we have been receiving in response to this inquiry, is it that we have been provided with the information that, in respect of the Red Sky Company, for example, that happened, Jim started with 2006, but again 2007 and 2008, right through to the Chief Executive, the Director and the Chair of the Housing Executive. So it seems to me that this went to a very, very high level within the Housing Executive, but at all times there were negotiations around monies and different figures arrived at by the end of those discussions.
Can I come at just one point on it?
Just as a to add that point.
Just to add that point. But I'm trying to get my head around how you recalculate from 250,000 to 20,000. You couldn't shed any light on that and how that's done?
I could explain in general terms, and maybe Raymond can fill in some of the detail. It is part of a dispute process, and you have two parties. And obviously, in the case of the Housing Executive, we would have done some work, some research to identify and quantify what we believe to be the problem. Those issues would then be put to the contractor. The contractor would be given the opportunity to present an alternative or an explanation or a reason, which may or may not cause us to revise our opinion. So that's the general approach which we've applied in terms of the more recent engagement with Red Sky. And sometimes we would accept that there could be different interpretations, or we provided with information that we didn't have at that particular time. What happened in that particular set of negotiations, I'm not sure, because I wasn't party to it. But perhaps, can you give some examples of where the movement was?
Absolutely. Yeah, certainly I was involved in the negotiations, but had no part to play in the decision making. With regard to the 264, how it reduced down to 20, the main bulk of that came from kitchens replacements. There was a substantial number of kitchens had been replaced by Red Sky. There's two types of kitchen that we would have in our scheduled rates. A post-formed, which is a fairly expensive, elaborate type kitchen, and a standard kitchen. What we were getting in the like of West Belfast, North Belfast, East Belfast and the like was standard kitchens, but we were paying for substantial post-formed kitchens, substantially more expensive. We picked this up and brought it to the attention of certainly management that certainly you're not getting what you're paying for here. You've got two codes, and of the two codes, you're using the wrong one. That summed to £157,000. So kitchens alone was a substantial bulk of this money. The whole figure of 264 was revised down to about 81,000 from memory. Of that 81,000, it was negotiated down to 60,000 or 61,000. And from that, it was negotiated down to 20,000, 2/3 being housing executive responsibility and 1/3 being the contractor's responsibility. And that's where the figure ended.
How would you establish that?
Tossing a coin. Tossing a coin.
It wasn't quite tossing a coin, but what I can tell you, the actual figure, a lot of it was put down to what was known and described as dead debt. And that term was brought to us by Red Sky, where the maintenance officers were quite often responsible for the overpayments, where they had post-inspected typical work, and they were saying, well, it's not our responsibility, it's the housing executive responsibility. So a lot of that was put across into our responsibility, and that's where I believe the director made the decision that we would bear the vast majority of this.
Well, that certainly comes across a lot in the various reports we have. But am I hearing correct, Raymond, when you say that the difference in the price was in relation to a better standard of a kitchen and a lower standard of a kitchen. It was the lower standards of kitchens which were fitted.
Yes, you were getting, what we were getting
So
was
how-
the standard kitchen,
Yeah.
not the more expensive one,
But
but we were
bill
paying for the more
higher,
expensive
yeah.
one.
So
Why
I
would
can
there be
understand
two
that
differences?
the logic was that
Two standards.
that was basically determined the maintenance officer signed off on the wrong unit. That obviously somebody either knowingly or unknowingly fitted a higher spec of a kitchen. I presume at the end of this, none of the tenants got a better standard of a kitchen.
No,
And the
no, we
public
got the
paid for it.
standard,
That
standard.
was written off as a dead debt. I'm bringing you in to be second, Trevor, so you're in the line for.
Now, I might add
It's
that
on that point, just,
our tenants was more than happy with the quality of kitchen that was being fitted.
But publicly, they paid for a higher
But
standard.
we were paying for a
They
different
didn't
type of
pay- Well,
kitchen.
the tenants paid for it, because they pay rent and whoever they paid, so. Trevor, you want to come in on that
just
point?
supplementing that, Chairman, and then I'll let my turn, I'm happy enough, but I'm just struggling why there's two different forms of kitchens. I mean, why isn't this not, whatever you want to call it, standard kitchen, I think you call it post-form, why is there not one housing executive kitchen?
We've even got three types of kitchens now, just to muddy the waters even further, but we've got a post-formed or foil wrap type kitchen, along with post-formed and our standard. It's just that our policy and procedures change all the time, our standards change. So all of a sudden, this year, we're fitting foil wrapped. Next year, we could have a different product in the market.
Sorry, I can understand in different years you may do different style kitchens, but let's take 2014. Are you telling me that across Northern Ireland there could be three different types of kitchens fitted, depending on where you live?
No, from here on in, we're fitting only foil wrapped.
Sorry, let's go back to 2007. 2007, could there have been three different styles of kitchens fitted regarding
At
where you
that
live?
particular time, two types.
Okay.
You see the problems?
And is there any rationale, I mean, as a matter of interest, is there any rationale as to why one area would get one standard and another would get another standard? You see where we're coming from on this one? Maybe let you think about that. Thank you, Brady, and then Trevor.
Yeah, a couple of questions for Declan. You were involved in negotiations with BDO about the transfer of former Red Sky employees under the TUPE arrangements to adjacent contractors. Obviously, there was a request for an extension of the Red Sky contract. How and when did you get notification of that? And did you raise any concerns with your side of procurement? And the second question really is, from the papers we've received, it's clear that you had some difficulties in those transfer arrangements. And could you maybe outline what the difficulties were? And also, do you feel that you had the support of senior housing executive and DSD management when you were doing these negotiations to get these former employees transferred under TUPE arrangements?
Okay. In terms of the extension of the contract, I'll just deal with that very quickly. My own line manager had asked a question because it had raised, obviously, at senior management team, could the contracts that Red Sky administration that we're running for us be extended? I explored that because I was asked to. I asked the administrator, was it possible on two occasions? And the first occasion that I got a reply wasn't very clear, so when I went back and asked for further clarification, can you provide us with service post the 14th of July? They said they could, but only to the 31st of July. That was it. They were out. To go further than that, something else would have to be done. In relation to the TUPE transfer position, I did liaise extensively with the administrator. I wouldn't say negotiated, absolutely not. I liaised with the BDO, the administrator, to make sure that there was a smooth transition and to ensure that the service provision was maintained during the period of 13th, 14th, 15th of July. You could say that there were negotiations, obviously, with the contractors that were in the adjacent contracts in order to make sure that they were able to put that in place. But the involvement that I had with BDO was to make sure that any information transfer is there to ensure that those employees were not disadvantaged.
Did you experience difficulties? And again, the question I asked, do you feel that you had the support of senior management?
Yes. Yes.
But there would be issues around TUPE transfer because it represents a period of uncertainty.
Absolutely.
For the employees to start with, but also the new employer. So they have to be able to determine what are the responsibilities they're taking on board, what are the associated costs, how does it fit into their contract structure. So we have found, unfortunately perhaps too frequently over the last couple of years, given the state of the economy, that we have had to devote quite a bit of time getting a lot of detailed personnel information that has to be provided to the incoming contractor. So there's always a fair bit of work around the Chupi transfer.
Sorry, Mr. Brady, was it those difficulties in particular you were?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, Trevor?
Yeah, Chairman, I sort of want to go back to this kitchen thing. In terms of the, we bet that shouldn't, but in terms of the most recent overcharging, where it was announced in the House, there's £18 million. What was the main aspect of that contract where you turned it back?
Could you repeat the last bit of your question there? Sorry.
Well, we talked about where it was announced originally to £18 million, it came down, it negotiated down to £2 million. Where was that variance at?
I understand that was discussed this morning. However, very quickly.
Sorry, I apologise, I couldn't make it this morning.
No, sorry, I wasn't criticising you.
Obviously, Jim's getting excited about it.
The original estimate of £18 million was the maximum potential overpayment exposure. It was based on an extrapolation, as probably was explained this morning. When we progressed the work undertaken by Mayor MacDonald in our case, and by another expert in the case of the contractors, we reached a point where we could estimate what the level of overpayment was in the schemes covered by the negotiated settlement. We then looked to see what was the estimated value of the compensation events associated with those schemes, and that's where we went from 18 million to 12.5 and 10 something. The difference between 18 million and where we ended up was the 18 million covered all schemes. The negotiated settlement only covered a proportion of those schemes. And with the passage of time and the effort and time invested to examine more schemes, we had a much better set of information to allow us to determine the figures. But as I say, that, I understand, was discussed this morning.
What portion was it?
There was a movement, I think we took, off the top of my head, took about 4 million out of it, perhaps. I can get back with the exact figures, but it's in the business
important
case.
to use exact figures, and Clark's right, Trevor, was discussed extensively this morning, although part of that, substantial amount of that was explained as accountancy mechanisms, whilst the settlement figure reduced down to somewhere in the region of £600,000, if I remember correctly. So we've up to down, and therefore we've got to deal with the factual reporting of it.
I'll come back in a minute.
Yeah, no, I appreciate
that.
Okay. Jim and then Dolores.
Thank you for your presentation.
Sorry. That's okay.
Oh, sorry, Jim, and then
Go ahead, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, thank
We're all
you.
in a good mood now.
I was just starting to flag a wee bit here, Chair. The question one of the questions I have, I'm trying to just get the sequence in and put some names, to the people responsible, because it seems very difficult to tie down just who is accountable within the whole scenario. But I have some concerns that have been raised, I think, last week with the Northern Ireland Audit Office and have been reported in various reports, I think, including yourselves, where you had given some of your findings to the former Chief Executive and former Director of Housing and Regeneration. And I also understand that, I think Mr McVeigh, might have been yourself, that the Repairs and Inspection Unit investigation, you had concerns made by those persons, which obscured the facts from the board or the Housing Executive.
Yeah.
Could you really elaborate a wee bit further on that?
For context, I was brought in the summer of 2008, and in the early part of 2009, I was asked to consider a whistleblowing letter which had been received by Audit Office from a chairperson of a housing community association in West Belfast, alleged problems with Red Sky in West Belfast. Housing Executive had asked the Repair Inspection Unit, Raymond's team, to do some testing of the work, particularly in West Belfast, but in other areas for comparison purposes. And then I was asked to quality assure the report which Raymond's team had produced into that. Raymond's team had concluded that there were problems with Red Sky's contractual performance in West Belfast, and had calculated an estimated overcharge. It's sort of familiar terrain, I guess, for the committee in terms of this. And I was asked to have a look at that. So that was my first sort of involvement with Raymond and his team. Raymond at that stage was, his RIU unit was embedded within the Housing and Regeneration Division, so he's effectively working for the same director and division who had responsibility for managing Red Sky. So I looked at the report and felt that the RIU team's work was sound, and had made observations in that, sent them up to the Chief Executive correspondence. My recollection was that Raymond was asked to go to a meeting with the Chief Executive and Director of Housing Regeneration, and following...
That was Paddy McIntyre and...
Colin McCallie.
Yeah.
And following that meeting, a second draft was produced, which I had been given sight of and discussed with Raymond. Changes made to the draft were, my understanding was at the instigation of the Chief Executive and former Chief Executive and Director of Housing Regeneration. So, having looked at the two drafts, I felt that the changes that had been suggested weren't helpful, that they, in my view, they had obscured the clear analysis that had come out of RIU's initial draft, which did indicate that there was some substance to the whistleblower or whistleblowing letters allegations. So I went back to the Chief Executive and copied in the Director of Housing Regeneration and said I didn't agree with the changes. And again, from memory, I think the initial draft then was the version then that was sent to Audit Office, along with my comments on the changes.
And so yours went to the Audit Office?
Well, it would have been Raymond's report,
Yes.
which I agreed with.
Yes.
And the Audit Office would have got that report and also my analysis. And then I was asked to go up to the Audit Office to meet with the then sort of lead Audit Office director, who had responsibility at that stage for the Housing Executive role. And we met, and I discussed with, it was a chap called John Buchanan at that stage, and I discussed with John Buchanan the RIU report, my quality assurance, and thoughts on the different drafts.
And the Audit Office picked it up from there?
Yeah.
Okay. And I don't know which, if any of you is able to help us out with who the contractors were who picked up on the work that had initially been Red Skies and then the contract was terminated.
The Troopy transfer?
Yeah. When the termination finally affected, we put in place 3 contractors. They were adjacent contractors. We put them in place under a backup support clause that enabled us in circumstances like that, where either contractors terminated or it was an insolvency. So we put in place PK Murphy Construction, Whitehorse Facilities Management Limited, and H&A Mechanical Services into the Red Sky contracts.
So they then became some of the contractors against whom we now know the Minister made spurious allegations against in relation to an 18 million overpayment.
Sir, well, leaving aside what you just interpreted what the Minister said, as a point of fact, the response maintenance contracts are different.
Oh, no, I
from the
appreciate
plan
all of
maintenance
that,
contracts.
but the fact is, they got Red Sky's work, some of them.
Okay, a different type of contract. Okay, fair enough. Is that okay, Dolores?
Thank you.
Jim?
Yeah, I just want to take you back to this matter we were discussing of the pattern over the years of Red Sky successfully negotiating down overchargings, etc., and getting a pretty good result for themselves. Can I ask you, gentlemen, this? Was there any pattern of political lobbying in support of Red Sky at those times when they were looking to get their figures reduced?
I can say, one, for part of that period, I wasn't employed by the Housing Executive, but I am not aware of any lobbying that went on, personally.
I'm not aware either.
Oh, and we were never, Raymond or myself were ever involved in any meetings or discussions with any
No,
political representatives.
Not necessarily meetings, could there have been correspondence?
There may well have been correspondence, but nothing that would have been directed to, I believe, anyone at this table.
But to whom could that be checked?
Yes, I'm not aware of anything, but yes, we can check it.
Okay, thank
Do our
you.
best there.
Okay, let's get just ask three final points here, because there's nobody else in the queue to. Okay, so then come on in.
What was it? I think I've lost trail of thought. Back to the kitchens. Yeah. Back to the kitchens and the three. I'm wee bit. I mean, and quite rightly so. If someone's overcharged, they shouldn't get paid. I have no issue with that. What I'm struggling a wee bit is, given that it has been recognised that this has gone on since 2006, 2007, right up to 2014. What has the housing sector been doing in terms of checking whenever these contracts are awarded and invoices coming in terms of the work? I mean, what's the inspectors doing in terms of actually the quality of the work and actually in terms of the kitchen and what we're actually supposed to be paying for? What's happening here?
Maybe I can answer that. We've got several levels of inspection. The first level is our maintenance staff, actually on the ground. So when an invoice comes in, before it's paid, it is actually checked that the accuracy of the work, the quality of the work and the accuracy of the payments.
So let's stop there a second. So your first of 7 checks is someone actually goes out and checks the quality of the work, and you're paying for what you got. So then, Raymond, how in this case, in terms of Red Sky or any other contractor, could they have charged you for a post-formed kitchen, but you get a standard kitchen fit?
Yeah, can I just clarify? When I say we check, it's not every job. It's a sample of jobs that we check. So at the time of Red Sky, for instance, we would have been checking, the Housing Executive would have been checking 20% of all jobs coming in. All COTs, which is change of tenancies, is mandatory. At that particular time, all of them were checked. So if you had a new kitchen, for instance, it would have been checked. Our staff are well trained. We find issues where some staff obviously had passed work that they shouldn't have passed and recovered monies that they should have. That's well documented in our various reports. We have invested a lot of time. You would have heard from your sittings with our Chief Executive telling you that we've carried out extensive training for our staff, and moving forward, we shouldn't see those same issues.
When did the training start?
We're closely monitoring.
When did the training start?
Training has really started immediately after the whole Red Sky situation. We reviewed exactly what the issues were. We brought it to the attention of our senior management, and those training developments took off from there.
Would you suggest it's working?
Absolutely.
So if it's working, then how are we in the most recent situation that was talked about prior to the summer? Because I think actually reading this morning's report, some of that was in relation to kitchens as well.
You're talking about the planned maintenance?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to generalise this, Chairman. I'm talking about maintenance, I'm talking about public money, I'm talking about contractors, whatever label you want to give that type of maintenance. Contractors going in and doing work, putting in invoices. What systems have we got in place, or the housing have got in place, to prevent public money being wasted?
I appreciate that. I'm responsible for response maintenance with regard to the audit side of things. So I can give you an assurance that things have improved, and certainly in recent years.
In a general sense, the contractor is asked to do a piece of work, be it planned or response. We have systems in place which inspect that work and check it using a sampling approach. So the lower value items, again, we pick a small sample at random. As Raymond has explained, higher value items such as change of tenancies, we would go out and inspect it. What we have found through our experience is that on occasions, those inspection processes did not work as they should have. We look to see, are the controls adequate, are they robust? We do make changes to the controls from time to time, but looking back, the procedures were there to be applied. When we look back, on some occasions, unfortunately, those controls were not applied properly, and on some occasions we have had to take disciplinary action against the members of staff concerned. We then have a second line of review, as it were, in terms of Raymond and John's team coming in and checking to see if that work is being completed. As Raymond has said, on the response side, my understanding is that the indications are giving confidence that the controls and how those controls are applied are operating effectively. However, we do need to make sure that colleagues, or maintenance officers in particular, they know what's required of them, they're trained, they're equipped to do the job. Looking back, it would appear that for varying reasons, those controls were not as applied as appropriately as they should have been.
Chair, could I just add to that, in terms of Mr. Clark's question? Contracts that you're referring to are historical contracts. Since then, and since the DSD Health Check review of procurement and contract management with the Housing Executive, we've reviewed our procurement strategies, our contract management procedures. So the new contracts that are in place, response maintenance, for instance, was put in place in 2012. The new planned schemes procurement was started over a year ago. It went live earlier this year. So we'll see as we move along from now whether what we've put in place has bettered what we had in place.
I can assure you, given our recent experiences, we are not complacent. We take very seriously the need to have proper controls in place and to make sure those controls are applied. However, what we're finding in some cases, particularly response maintenance, are the controls so rigorous that we're not getting an effective use of resources, and that's something we're looking at. But all the way through that, it's about making sure we get the right quality of work at the right price at the right time, and it's about getting the right balance so that while we trust the contractors we work with, we also test and inspect and make sure that those three things are being met.
In terms of that trust, in terms of your point you made earlier about picking 20% in terms of that sample, do you pick them or are those identified to you?
I believe that on the response maintenance, the computer picks them around it.
It's currently, the inspection regime has moved forward under the new NEC contracts. It's a statistical sample that is selected for the maintenance staff. So it's not picked, it's randomly selected for them and across the whole range of various priorities of work, from building, plumbing and electrical.
Okay, Trevor.
Sorry, can I just come in on that after Trevor? The overpayments, again, back to the 264 reduced to 20, were there any other companies that were afforded that luxury of having their overpayments reduced?
At that particular time? Not at that particular time.
But there has been subsequently?
That there has, yes.
Okay. And around that time, also see here, Leeway Maintain Limited has been highlighted here also, that they had an overpayment of 243,000. Were there any others being investigated?
There's currently one other being investigated at the minute, which is still a live case.
Okay, so we don't have a figure for that either. No. Okay.
Okay, Paul, thank you. Before bringing Fran or for final point, there's a couple of wee niggling concerns that I would have, well actually more than niggling, they're quite serious. In terms of the range of investigations and reviews that you have conducted over the years, as I referred to earlier on, and Jim referred to it extensively as well, in terms of 2006, 7, 8 and 9, I'm asking Kenneth, John there and yourself, Raymond, in terms of, would alarm bells not have been ringing when you're going to senior management, having identified a range of concerns, then you get draft letters changed to which you described obscured the picture, and then you get interventions from senior management team here saying, okay, we'll recalculate that on there, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but my reading of this would be if the RIU were conducting a calculation using the failed jobs only, that's what's referred to here, then you were advised then to recalculate the figure using the entire inspected sample.
That's correct.
Would that tell me, because that reads to me, and I may be wrong, that you would get a more positive answer?
You'll get a more positive feedback, yes.
Okay. So, see, if I was in your business and I was saying to myself, what's the problem here? There's an issue. Because this is a recurrent thing over a number of years. With the same people involved, same problems, same solution. There's a problem, negotiate it downward. So at the very, very least, there is incompetence to some extent there. So somebody somewhere along the line has been failed, and I mean, for us, we are concerned about the public being failed because it's public money. So if there's a problem identified, it says this figure, and then you go and negotiate, then it's down that figure, that may be very appropriate. But it seems to me, from where I'm reading it and what I'm reading, is that's a familiar pattern which I would be very unhappy about if I was in your position. So the question I'd be putting to yourselves is, if that was a concern triggered in your mind, having reviewed all of these things, would you have went to senior management and said, hold on folks, there's a serious problem here and it needs addressed? And if that was done, who was it done with and what was the response?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I maybe should take this one because give some context. I think I'd answered the member's question earlier about the draft 1 and 2. I'd come into Housing Executive in mid-2008. Raymond and his team had been in their role for quite a bit of time, additional time, longer time. But that said, structurally, one of the problems was with the work. I mean, Raymond's team had a great technical knowledge. They had identified issues, as I think the presentation that you've received would identify over a period of time. But the difficulty was, and I think this has been recognised both in the Department's Governance Review 2010 and the Audit Office Contract Management Value for Money Report, structurally it didn't help identifying problems when RIU were embedded within the same division that was managing the Red Sky maintenance contract. Because as RIU were identifying problems, I think you've seen that, you can see Raymond's technical knowledge, he's identifying problems correctly, escalating up the line. They weren't going further in terms of to beyond the senior management team into the board and beyond. So that is one explanation why it has taken such time to address this particular contractor. Response that the Housing Executive Audit Committee and Board took was after the response to the whistleblowing letter in 2009 and further consideration of that issue, RIU were detached from the Housing Regeneration Division and they were managed by myself in the Internal Audit Department for a period of time. So that helped to get an independent voice to the inspection findings coming out of RIU, and then that was really bringing the attention of the board, the audit committee and board to these issues which had existed obviously within the Housing Executive for a period of time. And as other issues then were examined, the planned maintenance inspection unit then was similarly detached from the division that it was, customer-facing division that it was attached to, and those inspection functions were centralised in a unit called the Corporate Assurance Unit, and that unit was independent then of the operational management and ensured that there was better reporting. There's been a whole range of other governance structural changes over my time in 6 years in Housing Executive, and now ultimately where we are is the Corporate Assurance Unit was recently merged with the Internal Audit Department in one Audit and Assurance Department, which Clark, I think, referred to earlier. So I mean, that's a major step change from where we were 6 years ago. I accept, looking at the narrative hindsight, one could wonder why it has taken so long to address some what appears to be systemic issues. But I mean, from an audit, insurance, inspection point of view, I mean, that sort of evolution has changed things considerably, and I think it's improved things.
Well, I mean, I appreciate that. And for Tavern information, if you don't recall, last week we had the Auditor General who confirmed that that process is improving ongoing, and that's very good news. But when I look at this, I see, yes, there are structures, and yes, it was probably appropriate to separate out structures, but in real terms, I mean to separate out individuals, really. I know, because the structures, people populate the structures. So it may well have been, and I may be wrong, but it would appear to me, having listened to this over a long period of time there, that maybe people were too close working together. That wasn't very healthy, so you separate out the various structures, and that's grand. But I still see a glass ceiling in there somewhere, and it went on for, it seems to be too long. And actually, I'm saying myself, and obviously yourselves are in various positions at certain different times, but from looking at the picture in front of us, and that's why I'm asking, like, if you were bringing this up to senior managers' attention to
Yes,
say,
understand.
there is a problem here, folks.
Yeah.
What are you doing about it? The last ceiling didn't actually move too far up.
Sorry, Clark.
Could I just say, John has described, we have made important changes to give the
No,
audit
I
and
understand
assurance
that, but
team
that doesn't-
a clear voice. As a senior manager, remember, as a director of finance, I can assure this committee that I and my colleagues in the new management team, our board, are clearly and strongly committed to making sure the housing executive delivers the best quality service. That we've got good governance, we do our business the right way, and we do it well. I can give a personal assurance that if John brought any issue to me and he thought he wasn't being taken seriously, as Director of Finance, I would take a personal interest and make sure that that was properly aired and properly discussed. And I know that view is shared across the board and across the current senior management
But
team.
I'm entirely satisfied that is the case, and I'm not taking any issue with that whatsoever, and I'm further encouraged by your own passion this morning, or this afternoon, in outlining that. But clearly, from where I'm reading, that wasn't always the case, and that's the point I'm trying to get at.
Yeah.
Where that doesn't appear to have been the case, where was the pressure points, who was reporting up, and who was then saying, hold on a second, why is this happening?
Yeah.
And I'm not really getting that much more on that. Maybe I can't get one.
But to try and directly answer your question, Chair, I mean, so we came in, I had come in 2008. Clark had only come in briefly, I think, a number of months before me. So you had two. I think one of the, talk about the people, I mean, one of the things in my view, I can remember different times having this conversation with Clark, was that a number of key people came into the organisation that were new to housing executive quite soon after each other. Clark was one, myself was another. The then head of corporate assurance was another. And you had people coming in from outside who would have had good experience and background, and perhaps good practice elsewhere, and then brought that experience to bear. Myself personally, I mean, that step change to take RIU out of housing regeneration took conversations with the Chief Executive, the Chair of the Audit Committee, and the Chair of the Housing Executive Board to brief them on why that would be something that would be important to do. So, I mean, did that take too long for the, you know, perhaps with hindsight, maybe the organisation could have moved quicker, but that was the process that we went through at that stage, and I think the benefits are now being felt really throughout the organisation.
Okay, thanks for that. And the last point before we bring Trevor, Fran and then Trevor, the last point I make just in terms of the, we addressed this a little bit earlier, in terms of the two being across the RSK workforce to via BDO. I mean, was there a problem around that, or because clearly BDO were working to what they probably believe was the ministerial time frame in this, whereas the housing sector were working towards the 14th of July. So was there an issue at that time?
With the conversations that I had with BDO were clearly focused on the 14th of July, and there were several emails sent to the administrator making it quite clear that that was the agenda we were working to, and that the information needed to flow to those incoming contractors as quickly as possible to ensure a smooth transition occurred.
And that's exactly what happened.
That's exactly what happened.
No, thank you for that. Appreciate that. The Fraz, a small point there, Trevor.
It's just a point. Was I do remember the certainly the West Belfast end of stuff, and I know Trevor tried a sectarian thing earlier on. But
we're getting on there swimmingly without introducing any more.
The fact of life was that it affected all four constituencies, including Abbey 1 and 2. And if you read through the report, all of them were affected by Red Sky. Now,
Weren't all Red Sky?
Well, in terms of maintenance contracts, but I know that in terms of my own constituency and speaking to the local district, as a matter of fact, the manager in the district at that time was one of the people who pushed the whole question of the difficulties with Red Sky with the mine. And I remember actually complaining about individual complaints, and I was being told it was a battle a day with Red Sky over the cost of thing. And they actually walked away from contract, or walked away from repairs until they could argue for an uprating of the price for each of thing. And most of the people that you were dealing with in the housing executive at a district level were saying it's nearly impossible to deal with these people. That you just go in, they give you say, well, we can't do it for that price, and they walked away from the house. And that added to some of the problems around what has been portrayed as sectarianism and conduct.
I'm not sure that's a point you've made, so Trevor.
Thanks, Sharon. Just come back and sort of add on to the point you were making. Lee, in response, I listen to what you said, but in terms of the audit committee themselves, how familiar were they with all the problems in terms of the contracts?
Well, they would have been, what they would have received would have been various reports which would have set out a narrative of particular inspection or audit in a particular area. So that tends to be a summary of issues, but it might not have dealt in some of the specific detail that you would have heard today, for example, from Raymond. Another issue would have been that the RIU reports at that stage hadn't been properly escalated to the audit committee. There would have been maybe perhaps one line, but no detail of the inspection, generally of the day-to-day inspection results. So that again has changed. If I could contrast that with what the audit committee, audit and risk committee received now, they would receive detailed summary reports on each of the inspections that have been carried out across the response and plan maintenance, and they get a summary of issues, specific issues in terms of where non-compliance with the contract has been identified and the result of that in recommendations. So I think it's fair comment, having sort of seen 6 years of the audit committee and what they have received by way of briefing and reports, that they now get they now get the necessary detail to brief them specifically about performance arising out of individual inspections.
When did that change come?
Well, there would have been different changes at different points over the last 6 years. The most recent change has been in June of this year, where the newly merged audit and assurance unit has been launched or pulled together. And I would now report as a sort of single responsible officer for both of those areas. So now I have taken a view that the Audit and Risk Committee need to see not just a red sort of traffic light analysis of a red indicating a poor performance scheme, a green obviously performing well, but actually the narrative behind that, the detail of what was the location of that inspection, the detail of the findings, the implication in terms of any risk issues and any recommendations arising. That now is going to that is now going to the Audit and Risk Committee in detail. So that's the most recent change. But at different points over those 6 years, they would have received, I think, incrementally more detail. And I would, in my view now, that the Audit and Risk Committee, in terms of this whole asset management, maintenance area of our business, are now getting the necessary detail to allow them to make the appropriate judgments and decisions.
In your response to the chair, you referred to, in terms of since you came into post and this new unit that's been set up, the unit you're heading up, that you had a conversation with the chairman of the audit committee. Is that what you said?
That would have been before the formation of this new unit. That would have been actually after I was asked to work with Raymond's team to quality assure some of the work that was coming out of the RIU team.
Who is the chairman of the audit committee?
Current chair.
Or whoever you had the conversation with?
Oh, really? That's the former vice chair of the board, Anne Henderson.
Who, sorry?
A lady called Anne Henderson. She was the then vice chair of the board and chair of the audit committee.
Okay, Trevor, fair enough. Okay, members, but we're fine for this afternoon. Obviously, no other member wanted to raise anything additional from what they've already done so far. So, any of yourselves want to make any points, clarify anything, add anything, make any kind of statement you want? I mean, obviously we'll have to, as a committee, reflect on what we've heard today and maybe come back to some issues for further information or clarity or whatever. So if you don't have anything that you want to add now, I mean, feel free to do that if you want to come back to us with anything. As I say, keep it as a two-way process. The door's open from yourself to come to us if you want to change anything or correct anything or add anything, and likewise we maybe want to come back to yourselves.
As a general point, and I'm not going to dwell on individuals, certainly my 73 years in the housing executive, there has been a sea change over the last 3-4 years. We've made structural changes. There is much greater transparency, visibility. I can assure you that all concerns, all suspicions are taken extremely seriously, and we investigate them. We do not brush things under the carpet. We have a lot of people looking in on us, this committee, the audit office, our board. So there is a very healthy, in my view, atmosphere, climate, and certainly people shouldn't be afraid or reluctant to voice their concerns, because they will be taken seriously.
Okay, well, look, again, thank you, Clark, because I appreciate the committee will be robust, but we certainly do wish you well in your job and don't want to give you any added burden. But clearly we have a public responsibility here. Okay, so thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, members, I suppose we'll just conclude this particular evidence session for this afternoon. That being the case, is there any other item of business, any other business from any member? If not, then the meeting stands adjourned. Thank you.
And Assembly Committee Room.